Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Rising Sign Horoscope. I'm Claire Moon, and today we're going to be talking about Saturn and Aries. I have made a couple of videos already that will pair really well with this. It doesn't matter what order you listen to them in, but I've got one on the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries, as well as a video that compares our natal Saturn placement to where Saturn is in Aries currently. So we can put all this together. I've got some nuance in those other videos, but today I really wanted to focus in on info on Saturn, info on Aries, putting them together, some thoughts that I had about what we might be able to expect. So before I get into the rising sign horoscopes proper, I wanted to do a bit of an introduction. So we'll do that. Before I do that, I want to do a bit of my usual how best to use this information. So, of course, find your rising sign. If you don't have your birth time, if you don't know your birth time or don't have access to it, you can use your sun sign, but I am operating off of rising signs, and so that'll be the most accurate way to use this. As well as, if you do need to go generate your chart somewhere, you can use the Chani Nicholas site, you can use AstroSeek, AstroDeanst, or Astro.com. All of those are very trustworthy chart generators. You can pause this video, go get your chart if you need to. And then know that there is one big distinction I want to note today between natal charts that are day charts versus night charts. So I guess I'll bring up my screen. One way to tell is we find the ascendant and the descendant, and this sets up our horizon. And then we can imagine, if you're standing in the middle of this, what seems like kind of an abstract circle, but it's a real sky at any moment that's been squished onto a 2D surface. Here we see the sun is definitely above the horizon. It's about noon where I am right now. So if your birth chart looks like this, if you've got the sun above the ascendant descendant degrees, you're a day chart. Now, let's pretend that we're moving forward and the sun's going to set. If you find your sun below the horizon in your birth chart, that's going to mean that you're a night chart, a night baby, if you will, versus a day baby. So why does this matter? Why do we need to identify this? Because Saturn is our main topic today, and Saturn tends to be a bit more constructive, operate a bit more favorably for people with a day chart. And Saturn can be tougher if you have a night chart. So I just want to speak to that plainly. As I give interpretations today, I have my kind of meter, my interpretation meter that goes from favorable to unfavorable. As I'm doing interpretations today or bringing up possibilities or potentials, I'm going to be bringing up some really favorable ones, neutral to less favorable or not favorable. And so if you are a day chart, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have some of that difficult Saturn stuff come up or that it's not going to be a drag, but you're going to also have more of probability, more likelihood of having a favorable experience with Saturn versus if you're a night chart natally. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have constructive, decent experiences with Saturn, especially if your Saturn is in good condition in your chart. But when I'm giving interpretations today, I would like you to unfortunately take heed of more of the difficult possibilities. So again, constructive things can happen, but for night charts, it's going to tend more toward difficult with Saturn. So I just want to name that nuance as well, those kind of shades of gray in between the best possible scenarios and the most difficult possible scenarios. I guess I would like to also, and how best to use this information, some introductory kind of things, just kind of trying to field questions or things that I'm anticipating people might have regarding Saturn. One thing that often comes up is karma. And I'm a Western bodied white lady. What do I know about karma? I'm not going to pretend like I know a whole heck of a lot, but my teachers really do. I'm part of a Sangha. I've been part of a Sangha for a few years now. I have a teacher, Siddhasuba Jan. They give me other teachers that are really great. And so on my website, www.aligninglightastrology.com, On my resources tab, which is for student astrologers, I've got a bunch of resources available. I also have a button that links to a PDF all about karma, or comma, if we're saying Pali versus Sanskrit. So check that out if you're worried about comma, if you're worried about karma, if you're worried about any Saturn stuff having to do with that, go read that PDF about it. Educate yourself from a Buddhist standpoint. I know there's lots of different cultures and traditions that have ideas about karma, and in even more different cultures like Greco-Roman astrology, they were talking about fate, right? So there's all kinds of ways that cultures deal with these concepts. So I realize that, this perspective is just one, but I don't want to talk about it too much, but I'm going to let my teachers talk about it in the form of that PDF. So go check that out if you're worried. Otherwise, if you're not, don't worry about it. And I guess on that note, like the whole chart is karma to me. The whole thing is. Venus has karma, Mars has karma. It's the conditions that lead to fruits of various varieties. So I'm not gonna touch on it too much today. Uh, so we talked about sect, day chart, night chart. Talked about some philosophical stuff. Yeah, and I guess on that note, so trigger warning, content warning today. It's Saturn deals with difficult things. Saturn and Mars are our quote unquote malefics. They deal with more extreme, intense experiences in life. They describe what is difficult or unfortunate in life. Both of these planets that are difficult, intense, extreme experiences, they also do constructive, necessary, even favorable things. So everything is a coin with two sides, but we will be looking at kind of a gnarly side of one of our more gnarly coins today. So I just want to, not any specific, just kind of general content warning. There's going to be a lot of challenging topics that are going to come up, having to do with loss, death, grief, being forced to do things you don't want to do, uh, delays, suffering of various kinds, Saturnian sufferings. So just know if you're not in the mood for this today, you might want to save this video for another day. Or you gather your resourcing. If you do want to hear what we have to talk about, gather your resourcing or save it for a day when you do feel more resourced. Because again, we are going to be talking about some difficult stuff. And then lastly, in my little introduction, I pulled a Joan Halifax deck card. So we're going to do that because it's been a while. I had a little phase where I was doing that pretty much every video and then I fell off of it. But I know that we're having Saturn go into a fire sign. And I wanted to kind of balance that. I'm going to be talking a lot about fire today, but I actually chose a space card. I was looking at air and space because I wanted to see, what's opposite of Aries. We've got Libra, a place where Venus and Saturn have dignity. And so what might be good advice to balance whatever Saturn and Aries is experiencing? Because one thing I will talk about as a topic with Saturn and Aries is imbalance. And so here, the topic on this card is called resting in the gap. So if we're feeling tense in the next 2.5 years or in the next lifetime, we can always rest in the gap. So I'm going to do this tiny little meditation. It'll take like 2 minutes. If you're not into it, skip ahead. There's timestamps below. But for those of you who want to hang with this, let your attention rest gently on an in-breath. On the out-breath, relax into your body. Breathing in, let your body, heart, and mind settle. Breathing out, feel the release. Before your next in-breath, rest in the gap at the end of the exhalation. The next in-breath arrives naturally. Rest in the gap at the end of the exhalation, and the next in-breath arrives naturally. So that's a good thing to do if you're wondering, what do I do with this information today? What do I do with Saturn and Aries? If you're not sure what to do with Saturn and Aries, we can always just rest in that gap between breaths. It's a very peaceful place. It's very nice. I enjoy it myself. So I thought I'd choose that. I know that Aries is a sign of action, and it's not that we lean into inaction with Saturn. Saturn is inaction, but maybe we do both. Maybe we do a little bit of inaction and waiting or resting and then action. And sometimes that can be helpful when we're not quite sure what to do. And I think waiting or knowing how to wait, how long to wait, when and how long to rest is going to be important, because one thing that Aries and Saturn struggle with as, kind of two sets of archetypes that come together is pacing. Issues with pacing. Too fast, too slow, too much action, not enough action. So we can always come back to the now. I guess that's the last thing I'll say before we move on to the technical astrological bits, is that anytime there's tension coming in about the future, we can always come back to now and be like, what can I do right now? We're speaking of Aries, this very action-oriented place. What tasks, what actions can I take, or what waiting or rest can I intentionally take before I act that is the most skillful for whatever context you're in, which only you can know what is most skillful to do. So that's always helpful for me when I'm getting too heady in the astrology, when my mind is going in all these proliferative directions. I can always just come back to right now and be like, well, what's good to do right now? What should I do right now? And sometimes it's a really simple answer, like getting a snack. Other times it's like, I actually have to do work. So I think those are all my notes about how best to use this information, some philosophical notes. Find your chart, find your rising sign. Let's get into it. Let's talk about Saturn. Actually, before we talk about Saturn, let's talk about the dates of interest that are going to be most important. So as I record this today, it is July 17th. Saturn actually entered into Aries on May 24th of 2025. And they'll be in here until September 1st of 2025. Then they're going to go back into Pisces for a bit. And then until February 13th of 2026, we'll have that last bit of Saturn in Pisces. And then Saturn will be in Aries from February 13th of 2026 until April 12th or 13th, depending on your time zone, 2028. So this is a 2.5, 3-year transit if we include the time that Saturn's doing their dance between Pisces and Aries. It's a slower transit, but it is not forever. So it is good to bookmark that as we're talking about challenges or difficult stuff today, even things that, responsibilities that we love or hard work that we love, knowing that the good news is that we've got 2.5 years to work on it. And that the bad news is that we have to deal with it for 2.5 years. So it's kind of both, but it is not forever. So besides those ingresses that I mentioned, Saturn moving into different signs, we've also got a few other events that I wanted to note. So some stationings for Saturn, stationing, retrograde, stationing direct. I've got about 6 of these here. We just had one, July 12th of 2025, Saturn stationed retrograde. And then on November 27th, 2025, Saturn will station direct. And these are all noted below as well, below the video, if you want to copy and paste. I have July 26th of 2026 as our next retrograde station, stationing direct December 10th of 2026. And that final retrograde from August 9th of 2027 to December 23rd of 2027. And then finally, we've got some Saturn-Sun conjunctions, Saturn Cazimis, And I guess I could be noting this up here and showing you. And Saturn Sun conjunctions are times where Saturn goes through a rebirth. They are purified through the fires of the sun. They move through the heart of the sun within 1 degree of the sun. And not only is this a rebirth for Saturn topics, like a rebirth or a renewal for, say, boundaries or discipline or responsibilities or how we deal with grief or move through grief. It can also be a rebirth, a renewal for Saturn ruled topics like Capricorn, Aquarius, and all of those house topics will also go through this purification process or renewal process that happens about once every year. And so the last one we had was on March 12th of 2025. It was in Pisces. And then the next one will be March 25th of 2026 at 4 degrees of Aries, and then April 7th of 2027 at 17 degrees of Aries. And then those are the only two. So we just have two that are in Aries. But then this one at 0 degrees of Taurus right after Saturn moves into Taurus, April 20th of 2028. So not in Aries here, but we do have two of these renewal moments while Saturn is in Aries. And I think those were all my major datey dates. So, in short, I'm going to list a bunch of topics, essentially, a bunch of life topics with each rising sign horoscope. I'm going to try to name where in the life there's a higher probability of these Saturn things touching. And just know that those challenges in those areas of life are going to be largely from early 2026, February of 2026 to April of 2028. I think that's my last note on that before getting into Saturn. So again, Saturn's not alone. They're with Neptune. So it's not just going to be a kind of classic Saturn presentation. It's very influenced by other things while they're in Aries. So again, check out my video about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and how that might affect you by rising sign. But it's good to note too, I guess while I'm here, that I know Saturn is, and I'm going to talk mostly about Saturn affecting Aries today and the house topics that have to do with Aries. But also, it's going to be sending an opposition. Saturn will be sending an opposition to Libra, an overcoming square to Cancer. They're in a square with their own sign of Capricorn. So I just want to, not to make anyone be even more concerned, but just know that everything that I say here today, I'm not going to be covering every single area that Saturn could be influencing for you in your chart. I don't know what other placements you have. If you've got cardinal placements in Cancer and Libra, especially Libra and Cancer, you're going to have Saturn's influence probably affecting those areas of life as well. So I just want to name that. I'm not going to get into that and kind of expand to that level. I'm going to leave that for more one-on-one sessions with people. But yeah, just so you know, today is not an all-inclusive kind of look at how Saturn's going to affect you. Okay, so let's get into Saturn. I did list a bunch of references below. I'm mostly going to read out of Chris Brennan's Hellenistic Astrology and Demetra George's Ancient Astrology, but Vedius Valen's anthology is largely where a lot of the significations are coming from in Chris's book, so I'm not going to read them separately. They're very, very redundant. I also listed some decanic work from T. Susan Chang, Austin Coppock. Uh, I'm citing Jason Hawley and their Aries and Saturn in Myth video. It does cost money, so I apologize for that, but I am listing it as a resource and I highly recommend it. Great listen for getting ready for Saturn and Aries, especially when I talk about imbalance and balance. That's directly coming from me listening to that Jason Hawley video. And I also cited a tarot guidebook from Charlie Claire Burgess's Fifth Spirit Tarot deck. I looked at the 2, 3, and 4 of Wands to get some information. And all of that is below. So all of that is linked below if you want to buy those things. And then I also have a bunch of resources for navigating Saturn and Aries that I personally have curated over the years, think would be helpful for people to read or to be exposed to. So I do have one thing about grief here, one concept for thinking about grief. I've got a poem from Mary Oliver. There's a talk on loneliness from Thich Nhat Hanh that's really great. A couple talks about loneliness. Um, I also linked the Karma PDF that I mentioned below. And then I also linked the Kathavada Sutta for anyone who has, I mean, I'm linking that because I've got it in my third house. This is my third house that this is happening in, a place of communication and speech. So if you're looking for a helpful guideline in terms of third and ninth house, if say you're a Leo or Aquarius rising, the Kathavada Sutta might be helpful for you guys. And then in general, learning how to pause, navigating this, any kind of astrology, I always recommend Joseph Goldstein's book, A Practical Guide to Awakening, which you can find linked below. So all of these are my things that maybe could be helpful for some people depending on where this is falling in your chart. So check all that out. Let's dive into some Saturn significations. So this is where the content warnings are going to be applicable. We're about to say some words that might conjure up some difficult things. Just to be frank about that. This is just to show you what it looks like. Vidius Valens Anthology. The recent Mark T. Riley translation is really great. But then if I read, a lot of that information is in Chris Brennan's book, Hellenistic Astrology. Page 170 talks about Saturn. And why I want to really highlight Chris's book is because the footnotes are so great. So, I mean, you can see all of my highlightings, but more than half of this page is footnotes. Like a very small amount of the page is not footnotes. And this other page is almost entirely footnotes. And it's all the different Greek words and the different possible translations that we could have for a lot of these Saturn words. So if you don't already have this book, I highly recommend it for that reason. So I'm not going to go through all of this today. I'm just going to skim through a few things just to give us a feel. But the star of Saturn makes those born under him petty, malicious, having many anxieties, those who bring themselves down, solitary, deceitful, those who conceal their deceit, austere, downcast, those who have feigned appearance, squalid, clothed in black, importunate, sullen, miserable, given to seafaring, practicing waterside trades. He causes depression, sluggishness, inaction, obstacles in undertakings, long-lasting punishments, subversion of matters, secrets, restraints, imprisonment, sorrows, accusations, tears, being orphaned, captivity, exposure. He makes farmers and gardeners because he rules the soil. He also produces hired workers of property, tax collectors, and violent actions. He produces those who acquire great reputation, notable rank, guardianships, the administration of what belongs to others, and father of other people's children. Of substance, he rules lead, wood, and stone. Of parts of the body, he rules the legs, the knees, the tendons, the watery parts of the body, phlegm, the bladder, the kidneys, and the inner parts that are hidden. It goes on to name some illnesses, some disorders. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Definitely check out Chris's book, page 170 through 172. And that's going to describe Saturn. And then if we look at Demetra George's Ancient Astrology, Volume 1, they also give a description of Saturn. And we have, I guess I don't need the wheel for this. Saturn was associated, and this is from page 47. of ancient astrology. Saturn was associated with the destructive life force in nature due to its excessive cold, moderately dry, and constricting qualities. It is seen as a source of sorrow, misery, long-lasting punishment, grief, captivities, and mishaps. It brought slander, disrepute, and trouble. It signifies very old persons, matters that are long-lasting, old doings, help from ancient or obsolete things, or older persons and elder brothers. Saturn is also designated those who do not marry, widowhood, orphanhood, or childlessness. It goes on to say a lot of the same things we just heard. When Saturn is in good condition, it gives authority over fields, buildings, watery property, abundance, property of others, inheritance and windfalls, power to subordinate and suppress others, or to benefit from the losses of others. So this comes up with, I believe, both Mars and Saturn, is that when you gain, it is at someone else's loss. And one way that this has come up for me personally, because I have a very Saturn-Mars chart, is in healthcare. Anyone who works in healthcare, I get paid, or I did used to get paid, because other people were sick. Not great. That's the nature of that. So that's one way I think I've seen it come up in more of a neutral, societally accepted way that isn't just straight up thieving. But there's that. Uh, when Saturn is in bad condition, and this is reading now on page 48. When Saturn is in bad condition, it brings debt, imprisonment, false accusations, banishment, and chronic misfortune. The Babylonians named Saturn Ninurta, their god of agriculture, irrigation, war, sickness, and death. And the Greek Kronos was associated with old age and death. And the Roman Saturnus was a god of agriculture. The nature of Saturn is to endure. Its essence, according to Valens, is ignorance and necessity. From a modern perspective, it is the archetype of the elder. So we have Saturn. Um, other things, other notes I've had here about Saturn, uh, humblings, and this is broken down a bit in Chris Brennan's footnotes, but the idea of Saturn being brought down low, or the experience of being brought low, humblings, all of that is a vibe that Saturn brings. Saturn is often rejection. Saturn rules over the two signs that are winter in the northern hemisphere. So Saturn also rules, just when we think of seasonally, uh, the time of least light, the time of the least life, because light offers photosynthesis and life and everything else. We see loss, decrease, all of the things people experience in winter. It is the lack of abundance versus when we have Cancer Leo season, much more abundance. Everything is green and growing and full of life. Saturn represents the opposite. So we can also see them there in that duality pair. Saturn rules a cardinal and a fixed sign, so they know how to both begin things and maintain them. They also form structure, form itself, boundaries, borders, edges. When we think about order itself, there's this whole kind of diurnal, day sect, planetary thing with order, where it's like Saturn does the edges and the rules and the boundaries. The sun is the center principle, the anchor point. And then Jupiter helps to make it all make sense and bring it together and makes it cohesive. But Saturn definitely has a part in form and structure and building. They are also systems. Saturn is, not brick and mortar, but other structures that are unseen, like blockchain. That's a whole structure and a system. We heard words like constraint or constriction, limiting, limitations, reaching of limits, delays, barriers, authority people, things that I think we hear more in the modern tradition, but it makes sense to me. Mastery, becoming an expert at something. It sounds a lot different than ignorance. You know, ignorance makes a lot of sense for Saturn too, insofar as things are not lit up, they're dark. We can't see it, versus the sun really illuminates things, and is seen as kind of that knowing ability. Saturn could be seen as the opposite, ignorance, or secrets, or deceit, or not sharing. All of that makes knowing pretty difficult. Uh, at the same time, Saturn is long-standing hard work, long-standing challenges we work through, uh, discipline, delayed gratification, what endures, age, elders. And it's like you can't do all that and not become an expert at something, even if it's just how to operate yourself. Um, it makes sense to me why Saturn in some contexts could be ignorance and in other contexts could be mastery or expertise in something, experience at the very least. They are old, cold, and slow. They are rational. They are isolation and solitude and being alone. I just heard a quote today, like a few hours ago, and it was from Toni Morrison saying that uh, loneliness isn't about isolation as much as it's about being misunderstood. And if that ain't some Saturn stuff, if I ever heard it. Uh, Saturn is responsibility, obligation, hard work, death, loss, uh, accountability. It's the word no, as in rejection, which can be really helpful. We have to reject things in order to accept other things. We also have doubt. Saturn can absolutely represent doubt. Saturn's doubt can be helpful. It can be that kind of questioning of, do I know this? Is this correct? That leads us on to investigation that helps us to have a stronger stance. Or doubt can be unskillful or difficult, where it's just this doubt loop that keeps us in inaction, that keeps us from acting, that keeps us in a state of fear and not moving forward. So kind of having that discernment, especially with Aries house topics, you know, wherever that falls in your chart, if you're having some doubts, is it the kind of doubt that just requires a bit more efforting? Or is it the kind of doubt that is based on fear or a lack of certainty or a lack of clarity, where you get in the doubt loop, the analysis loop, if you will? That's a very Saturnian thing. And then finally, well, not finally, a couple other things. Control. So before we had Pluto being the control freak of planets, it was Saturn. Saturn has rules and standards. They want things to turn out a certain way. And that can translate to having a kind of a tight grip on the steering wheel, if you will. Uh, and then finally, the idea of realism. Saturn is what is real, what is realistic. It is disillusionment, the casting away of illusions, the casting away of fantasy. So that can be helpful. It can also be a drag. It depends on the context. So I hope at this point, Saturn is seeming clear, and at least the vibe is clear. And then we can compare that to Aries, because Aries is going to be way different. So let's get into that now, just on its face, a couple easy ones. Saturn is Saturn is slow, Aries is fast. Saturn is what endures, Aries does not. It's very quick, short bursts. Um, Saturn is old, Aries is more youthful. It is beginnings, the proverbial beginning, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. Um, so they're very different. One is about action, one is about inaction. So even though we have a planet and a sign, they both are going to hold some archetypes. These archetypes are very different. So looking at Aries, if we wanted to look into that Valens anthology, that's page 6. The house of Mars, a masculine sign, tropic, terrestrial, governing, fiery, free, upward trending, semi-vocal, noble, changeable, procuratorial, public, civic, with few offspring, servile, the midheaven of the universe, in the thema mundi. It's the 10th house. Depending on relationship with the house ruler, men born under this sign will be brilliant, distinguished, authoritarian, just, hard on offenders, free, governing, bold in thought, boastful, great-hearted, restless, unstable, haughty, inflated, intimidating, quickly changing, wealthy. Wow. So, we see a lot of things that I think, I mean, at least in my opinion, I was kind of surprised to see. Um, I was not expecting to see civic or uh, authoritarian or governing. But when you think about the sun having their exaltation here, it makes a lot of sense. So we have to think about Mars being the ruler of Aries, and we also have to remember that the sun is exalted in Aries. And there's this idea of rulership and um, putting order over things and acting as a leader. And I think when you put Sun and Mars together as they come together in Aries, you do get a lot of that kind of energy of leadership and so like this noble civic kind of thing. So I want to cover that. That's where that comes from. Um, Tropic, they don't mean it in the kind of warm weather palm trees way. They mean it insofar as the cardinal signs. So Capricorn, Cancer, Libra, Aries, they are all the beginning of the seasons, and they were also referred to as movable. The word tropica from Greek refers to a sense of motion or change. So that has much more to do motion change of a cardinal sign. So that's what they mean by tropic, just naming that. So what else? Bold in thought, boastful. That sounds very different than haughty, inflated. Very different than Saturn. Saturn is like over there doubting itself. Saturn is over there like questioning. And meanwhile, they're in an environment, they're going to continue to be in an environment that is asking for more of a confident approach. So that's really incongruent for Saturn. So we can hear some differences there. But when it comes to like governing, authoritarian stuff, Saturn jives very well with that. Now, what's concerning for me as someone who lives in America right now is this thing that Valens is saying, hard on offenders, because depending on who you label as the offender, that doesn't sound great. So hard on offenders, that gives us a big old red flag for when Saturn is in Aries, because already Saturn is saying no, it's rejecting, it sends things away. It's kind of, I mean, I'm projecting entirely my situation and my nation right now onto this, but having Saturn in a place, Saturn that already is authoritarian and rejecting, in a place that is hard on offenders. I mean, this is one thing that I was concerned about with Saturn and Aries from the get-go, before it even happened, based on natal chart examples, where I would see people with Saturn and Aries experiencing situations in life where they are just like overly made accountable or responsible, or like the crime not fitting the punish, or the punishment not fitting the crime. That phrase comes to mind, where even if something was done that was, not appropriate or whatever, um, the response to it being unbalanced, heavy-handed, out of line itself. That feels very Saturn and Aries, and I hope people out there aren't resonating with that one. But that's a real possibility, and that was I was kind of coming up with that even before I realized that this said hard on offenders in this very old book. So That's that's worth noting. As Billy String says, only breaking one law at a time. I know some people don't even get that privilege. And there was one other word too, procuratorial. Procuratorial. That was another word in Valens for Aries. And I had to look that one up because I had no idea what that meant. Procuratorial means one that manages another's affairs, an agent, if you will. In the Roman Empire times, it was an officer of the Roman Empire entrusted with management of the financial affairs of a province and often having administrative powers as an agent of the emperor. So that's something that Aries was associated with. And I think we're hearing again those ideas of sun coming in as well, providing order, management, um, public, civic, yeah, all of those things. And I put a link below to where I got some of this from Edym Online, that great etymology website. So then if we look to George, page 133 of volume 1 talks about Aries. And they give a lot of a lot of significations that are places. We also have got personality traits: bright, notable, just, bold, authoritative, braggarts, great-souled, inconsistent, haughty, threatening, quickly changing, well-off, unruly, irascible, kingly. So giving a few extra things there. And this is where I want to cite Jason Hawley's work, is thinking about this duality pair of Aries and Libra. And now I will actually bring up my wheel. We've got Aries, usually about one, singular. We've got Libra, usually about more than one, plural, two or more. And we've got this issue with balance. So we think of Libra as being balanced. We literally have scales over here. And so Aries can be imbalance. What is it to be out of balance? How to be successfully and navigate successfully being out of balance. And then confident versus cautious. So it's so interesting too, to in this scenario of talking about especially Saturn in Aries and comparing it to Libra, because Libra is where Saturn is exalted. And so Saturn loves Libra. Libra is about being thoughtful, considerate, cautious, careful. Saturn really jives with that, versus Aries is about being confident. So that's a very big difference. And Saturn is having to deal with that incongruency. Then thinking about Saturn being asked to be confident and Saturn also having to deal with being unbalanced, then when Saturn is in Aries, I'm going to be asking, what is it for Saturn to be out of balance? What is it for Saturn to be too much Saturn or not enough Saturn? Because I think usually I'm thinking, okay, Saturn is in fall. Saturn is going to be less strong, less powerful Saturn. But then when I think about unbalanced Saturn, it might be that we're getting too much of them, too much boundaries or rejection, uh, versus not enough. So it might not just be like a weak Saturn that's not able Saturn. We might also have a Saturn in Aries that is Saturning way too hard. It's very out of balance Saturn. I guess exercise that I would do with Saturn and Aries is think about what is it to have Saturn significations out of balance, and then asking how to get them back into balance if that is appropriate for the situation. Now, moving away from that topic of balance or unbalance, also Aries is doing things first, doing things for the first time. So as planets move through Aries, now Saturn is going to be experiencing doing things for the first time, having responsibilities for the first time, going through challenges or delays for the first time. The one that does speak most, I think, to me in a neutral, mundane sense is new responsibilities, just being in charge of things that you maybe not have not been in charge of before. So it could be that could be a Saturn and Aries thing, and potentially having it feel like it's coming on very quickly, a lot coming on very quickly. So doing things for the first time or being the first, especially if you're a Capricorn or Saturn ruled person, Capricorn, Aquarius rising, Saturn ruled chart, it's you, like you are doing it for the first time or being the first. Maybe the first to say no about a thing. That could be interesting. So now we do have to talk about the fact that Mars rules Aries. So then, as Saturn is in Aries, they're going to be asking for guidance, support, resourcing from Mars. So, with Mars being the ruler of Aries, we then have to follow Mars. And about, in general, if they're not in a retrograde, every 6 weeks, Mars changes signs. So, every 6 weeks, at least when Saturn is in Aries, so this won't be the case this September, October, November, December, January of 2025, 2026. This is not relevant to that. But when Saturn is in Aries between now and April of 2028, they're going to be getting different information every 6 weeks. They're going to be getting a different set of resourcing, advice, guidance. And so if we are waiting for Saturn things to change, for Saturn circumstances to change, maybe for Capricorn, Aquarius house topics to change, we may need to kind of wait that 6 week interval and see if things shift once Saturn's ruler changes signs. So that's something to note. And then also knowing that it matters what relationship they have by aspect. So Saturn's situation in Aries is not static. It is very changeable. It's got different phases that Saturn will have in this journey. They're going to be going through different decans, different bounds, and their ruler Mars is also going to be going around the wheel, having a different relationship with them over the next 3 years. So it'll be really interesting to see, knowing that Saturn's situation is very much fluid and dynamic and not stagnant. Even though they're going to be in the same place for 2.5 years, their circumstances will change a bit here and there. So we'll have to watch Mars. And then all of Mars stuff too, in terms of Cazimis, Phocis, when they're making their appearance, when they're under the beams of the sun, all of that will have these downstream effects for Saturn. Mars being action, conflicts, motivations, assertion, Mars's advocacy, their energy, how we do the order of operations. Mars is decision and choice. We can choose to do all sorts of things with Saturn. So just because Saturn is in Mars's territory, it doesn't mean that some of those decisions won't be Saturnian. I would, in that incongruency, in that difference between Saturn and Aries, then in terms of this balancing act of action versus inaction, waiting versus not waiting, we might have to try to have a balance, try extra hard to have a balance, put in more effort to keep balance so that we're not waiting too much, we're not hesitating too much, such that we it's like the rubber band that gets pulled back and then snaps and it hurts. So we don't want that to happen. So not holding the self back too much. We need to off gas and let off some of this Aries energy. We can't have Saturn just being a lid over whatever that is, because Aries is very expressive. It wants to go external and share whatever it's doing. It wants to act on things. And maybe the last thing about this incongruency is that hesitation can actually be dangerous sometimes. So whereas Aries, the really great thing about Aries is that they don't hesitate. And in some situations, that is exactly what is necessary. This goes for emergency stuff, emergency medicine, acute situations where quick action is needed. This also goes for a lot of like active um, mobility things. Like I think about gymnasts, acrobats. If you hesitate, you are going to damage yourself pretty seriously. You cannot hesitate. So there are going to be some ways in which I think Saturn and Aries is going to be that hesitation that could get us in trouble. So again, how much are we balancing, this quick action versus waiting, hesitating versus not hesitating? It's really going to be context dependent. And how, we're getting guidance on that is going to be affected differently every 6 weeks, with Mars changing signs every 6 weeks. So getting into even more weeds, because as I record this, Mars is in Virgo. So let's do it. There are these subdivisions of the zodiac where we have decans, we have bounds. And so this first decan, Mars ruled, second decan, the Sun, third decan, Venus ruled. All of these bounds, all of this stuff is going to affect Saturn's experience in Aries. So again, the good news here, I think, is that if something is difficult or you're waiting on a challenge to dissipate, just know that as Saturn moves degree by degree, their situation will change, circumstances will change based on Saturn's different experiences in here. So the first part of it, it is the fastest, most assertive, direct part of Aries, these first 10 degrees. So the first year of Saturn in Aries is going to be um, pretty abrupt change to have to adapt to. Now we do have some benefics in the first bounds, and so this is going to soften things just a little bit, especially in August when we know that we've got both of them that are going to be in a nice aspect even now. And in Leo, these benefics are going to be able to see Saturn if they're a bound lord, and that's going to soften what Saturn experiences there. Like there are hard things happening, but the consequences might not be the worst. Whereas, generally, if I just look at Mars, it's like this is a pretty harsh 10 degrees. So I would be extra careful around authority people for the next 2.5 years, depending on your circumstances, um, until April of 2028. But especially this first year of 2025, early like 2026, that's when Saturn is going to be in some pretty harsh territory by Decan. And so I want everyone to be extra careful so they don't get that kind of uh, the response not fitting what happened, a really unbalanced response. And in ourselves as well, watching reactivity, watching irritability. I'm projecting because ever since Saturn went into Aries, I've been like, my patience has been going down. Oh, that was actually my last kind of theme too I wanted to talk about. So I was mentioning like imbalance and hesitation and the difference in pacing, all of those types of things. But then there's also this matter of patience. Saturn itself can be very patient in some ways. It is what endures. It has this long-term view in mind. And in that perspective, I think sometimes Saturn can be patient. Aries, not patient. No offense. I've got Aries planets myself. I can relate. Uh, but there's no patience here. There's no chill in Aries. They're ready to go right now. So when it comes to patience, and I find that patience is actually, it's not just when we're waiting in line or when we're waiting to do something and trying to be calm and tranquil and not have as much like trying not to hold on to tension as we are waiting. This kind of definition of patience, yes, that is real. So watch, if that capacity for waiting is lower, or that capacity for being patient and not having tension while you wait. If that capacity is lowering with Saturn and Aries, that's a real possibility. Um, Especially if you're an Aquarius or Capricorn rising. But I see patience come out in a lot of other areas of life, like I think we take for granted how much patience comes in. Like when I have a task to do, I have to have the patience to put down other stuff, focus on a thing, and stick with it for as long as it takes to get it done. That is patience. Having the patience to slow down, to take a snack, to have rest or whatever. That's patience. I think sometimes when we're running, going through life, it feels good to kind of, just sprint through tasks, get things done. But within that, sometimes there's a lack of patience, a lack of being able to wait or sit or not do or not act for just a little bit of time. Patience is all up in all of that, as well as our ability to be compassionate and kind. All of that requires patience. Anytime someone, especially if it's like some people are easy to be kind to, animals, babies, so easy to be kind to, right? But other folks, other adults, sometimes less easy to be kind to because it's hard to be patient with people, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to give people another chance, to give people more time. All of this requires patience. So, as Saturn is in Aries, patience dials way down. And so, if we can all just be aware of that, kind of keep an eye on that in ourselves and others, watch it happening outside of ourselves as well, that'll be us seeing Saturn and Aries in real time. Not very much time goes by here before Saturn rejects. Saturn is very quick here to judge, reject. Saturn is quick to say no. And sometimes that's, again, totally context dependent. Sometimes, like, you need to be able to say no really quick. So I'll say, patience. We're gonna watch it. It's gonna change. And I think it's really great that we're talking about it now. I'm happy I actually was slow to do this video because I've now had 2 months to have Saturn in Aries. I've had almost a couple months to watch it and experience the difference between Saturn and Pisces. And let me tell you what, Saturn and Pisces, so much more chill, so much more patience. We had all the time in the world in Pisces. Uh, my capacity for open-heartedness, my capacity for so much emotionally was so much larger. And I notice Saturn and Aries, there's not enough time for all of that. It moves a little too quick. So, let's compare and contrast. Hopefully people are watching this video before 2026 and you can get a comparison at the end of 2025 for the difference. So that's one of the benefits of having Saturn do a little weird dance between signs. It doesn't cut it off very simply. I have to give you a bunch of extra dates to remember, but it's a really interesting exercise to be able to compare in real time over just the course of half a year, um, what it's like to have Saturn in two different signs. Don't get that opportunity very often. So I think at this point, getting into the weeds with the Decans even further, I want to mention Austin Coppock and T. Susan Chang's work, as well as Charlie Claire Burgess's work on the Fifth Spirit Tarot. So Coppock talks about this first decan of Aries as raw strength used in a direct manner. There's not a lot of subtlety. There's division, there's separation, there's transformation. He uses this example of splitting a piece of wood into two pieces of wood with an axe. It's a very transformative event. You're creating two things from one. And when we look at T. Susan Chang's information, they say that the ram goes into battle headfirst, the power of new life erupting forth, breaking through obstacles to start something new, a plow breaking through hardened soil. It's the energy to begin, the seed opening, rather aggressive. Uh, it's the individuation after the oneness of Pisces and the call to action and the hero's journey. And that's really interesting thinking about what T. Susan Chang was saying about it, being breaking through obstacles to start something new. And then we've got Saturn here, which is literally an obstacle, yeah, or this responsibility of breaking through obstacles, something like that. It's making it feels like that ram is going headfirst into something. And there's a possibility they could be running into a bit of a wall, in my opinion. So when we put Saturn into that environment, it's kind of putting a bit of a bottleneck in that starting process. Charlie Claire Burgess talks about inspiration meeting everyday reality, time to do the work of planning and foresight. So really that fire, that action of getting started, of the wand suit, but also Aries and fire. And this is going to be this kind of initiatory beginning vibe at the first, this very martial decan of Aries. This is May of 2025 to about May of 2026, with some exceptions when Saturn dips out for a second. The second decan, this is going to be more May of 2026 to May of 2027, when Saturn is in the middle 10 degrees of Aries. Then we've got the Sun rule decan. So Austin Coppock on this decan talks about leading by example, showing others how life can be lived by doing it and leaving that example. You may not have inherited this place. You may have had to make it yourself. There's a requirement of confidence to cut a path for yourself, to make a spot of your own. T. Susan Chang talks about order and good governance, this kind of benevolent order of things. There's possibility, if you do the planning, take the actions, what could come of that. So Charlie Claire Burgess mentions that this second decan of Aries is a lot like the launch after the dreaming and scheming of a thing. It's putting the plans into motion. So then after we put plans into motion, things are going, it's this very active phase of things. We get into the third decan, which is a Venus ruled decan, if I'm using that descending Chaldean order. And Austin Coppock talks about self-assertion in a potentially benefic way, very show and telly, attempt to assert the self by benefic means, attraction, charming. He mentions artisans. Venus struggling to keep sustained harmony in relationships here, but they're trying. It's not a place of relationship, but Venus is there trying to do it. Good at attracting and making relationships quickly, but sustaining them is difficult in this decan. It burns quickly and brightly. T. Susan Chang talks about this third decan of Aries being celebrations, things not meant to last forever, or making do in an unhappy place, kind of like a rest stop, a moment of ease in an otherwise uneaseful situation, safe refuge, temporary refuge. There's also notions of trying to do something good and not being able to for some reason. Venus trying to do something that's pro-social in a very antisocial place, potentially. So that's looking at these different decans, these different 10-degree chunks. And that last decan, that's going to be that mid-2027 to mid-2028. So if I take this as kind of a narrative or a story arc, Saturn is really moving through this place of beginnings, of initiations, of doing new things potentially, of carrying those things through, of sharing them with others potentially, or having some kind of celebration at the end of it, or some kind of even just safe refuge at the end for a minute, temporary refuge. So the last 10 degrees are not, in my opinion, as difficult as maybe these first 10 degrees if we're looking at it by decan. Now, if we look at it by bound, it's a bit of a different story because, of course, the last 10 degrees are tough. So this really does feel like Venus is trying to, make good, do what they can with a difficult terrain. So all to say, I think Saturn is going to have its ups and downs as it moves through these different places. Saturn being in the very leadershipy place of the sun, I don't know how easy that's going to be for them. I don't know if that's going to be any easier for Saturn than being in Mars's decan. Being asked to lead and be shining and bright and be this benevolent overlord when Saturn is not necessarily fitting that mold, that might be difficult for them. Versus, maybe Saturn in these last few degrees where they're in their own bound, maybe that'll be an easier little place for Saturn uh, to do Saturn stuff, which will have different effects on all of us. But I think the main headline here with all of these weeds is just showing how dynamic this is and how changeable this is over the next 2.5 years. And even though we do have this one kind of somber, ominous note of Saturn and Aries, it's not all that whole time. It's not all created equally. So with that in mind, a few more riffings and then we'll be off onto the rising sign horoscopes. So Saturn is in their fall in Aries. Let's discuss that for a minute. That means we're going to have a pretty well-behaved Saturn, misbehaved Saturn. There's a high probability of them not being their balanced self that has rules and structure. They might have a difficult time doing that. They're not well supported in Aries to do that. They're being asked to go too fast. So they are in their fall, they're unsupported, and there's an incongruence with where they are. And even when Saturn is doing really well, let's say Saturn is doing really well at being Saturn and saying, hey, have we thought about that yet? What are going to be the consequences of this action? Aries, the response in Aries is overwhelmingly sit down, Saturn. No one wants to hear about consequences. So even when Saturn is doing really well for what Saturn does, they're not appreciated. They're just very underappreciated where they are. And so we might be running into those things, especially in the house topics of Aries. But so it was like misbehaved Saturn, Saturn not well behaved, out of balance. And then even when Saturn is doing good Saturn stuff, and let's say Saturn is being balanced for Saturn, in Aries, it's unappreciated. This is what it is to be in fall. It's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So now that we know what Saturn's kind of experiencing being in their fall, then we can see that, yeah, there are going to be some challenges with pacing, authority, responsibility, timing, and even agency. So if we can maintain agency, maintain timeliness, sometimes that's going to be a good antidote. Uh, there is agency in waiting, there is agency in pausing. I think sometimes we think if we're not acting, then we've given up our control of a situation, but sometimes waiting is actually shows more agency than anything, shows more control over the situation, and can lead to better outcomes. Even if you just wait 15 minutes, it doesn't have to be like, oh, Saturn's delays are going to be 2.5 years long, 3 years long. Sometimes Saturn is just going to be doing these short little delays, and that's okay. That's okay. It doesn't have to be super big delays. So, and sometimes they can be intentional, I think. Uh, Enforcing boundaries might be a task over the next few years. Again, I think I've been seeing a lot in the news about, too much enforcement, like where those boundaries become barriers to connection. Uh, but then there are going to be situations too where boundaries need to be enforced, and that has to be done again and again and again thinking on a more personal level individually for each of us. So how do we stay connected with ourselves, with others, not overly rejecting ourselves, not overly rejecting others? Another question I have, another kind of incongruency here. Saturn is about realism and Aries is about instinct. That very hell yes, hell no kind of thing. Saturn's going to go think about it though for a long time. So, how do we listen to our instincts without being overtaken by this fire of knowing? And how do we also not dismiss or reject the instincts? So, we want to listen to the instincts and listen to the realism and the rationale and the overthinking, maybe that Saturn's going to do. How do we have both of them? Or how do we know, how do we discern when to just go with the instinct versus when to go with Saturn's doubts and look into it more, investigate it more before running off with the instinct? Saturn now being quicker. So the speed thing, what might Saturn be quicker to do? This is another little exercise I did. Saturn is now going to be quicker to construct, to take responsibility, to claim authority. Saturn is going to be quicker to dismiss, divide, accuse, punish, humiliate. Saturn will be quicker to doubt, to say no, to draw a boundary, to contain. Saturn will be quicker to judge or criticize, reject, or exclude. That reject and exclude come directly from Chris Brennan's Hellenistic Astrology as keywords. The one possibility is Saturn being quicker to do all their Saturn things, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's really great to take responsibility quickly. Sometimes it's not your responsibility at all, and taking on other people's responsibilities too quickly is a problem. Being quick to accuse, sometimes that's very good because it can stop a harm that's happening. Sometimes being quick to accuse is a problem, especially when Neptune is around and there's a lack of clarity or accurate information. So, all to say, we're going to be watching these things. Aries is really good at beginning again and again and again and again. It doesn't do things just once. I think it will do things repeatedly. They will do something, especially now with Saturn in there, with more endurance as well. So there is this, and I've seen this from people who have Saturn and Aries or Mars in Capricorn, but I've seen it with Saturn and Aries people as well. This ability to just be relentless. It almost starts acting like there's this fixity that Saturn brings into Aries. It almost starts acting a little bit like Scorpio. And we get this kind of tenacity and this ability to just show up and get up again and again and again. So that's a thing that could be really favorable. And then a little quote here, a couple little quotey quotes. Eunice Hung from The Art of Dating says, knowing your limits is wisdom. Saying enough is not the same as giving up. So Aries, usually pretty limitless. It thinks it can just do anything forever. It's fine. It can have it do really brave and bold things because of that belief. But then of course Saturn is limits. And here I think what Eunice Hung is saying is that it's there's not a bad thing to understand limits. It doesn't make you less powerful or less strong. And it also, saying enough is enough, drawing a limit or enforcing a boundary does not mean that you've quit something or stopped something or given something up. You can actually, in order to keep something in the life or keep someone in the life, you make these boundaries. So it can be, Saturn can be those, when we talk about limitations, if we are intentionally honoring a limit, sometimes that can be a positive thing. Saturn as channel, Saturn as edges and borders, kind of narrowing but guiding the flow of something. So Saturn trying to, and it's hard for Saturn. I don't know how successful we're going to be at this. Probably not super successful, but we can try to use Saturn to channel Aries. I've seen it done. I've seen birth charts of people who have had to work with this energy their entire life, and they are excellent channels of their energy. They can do it very skillfully. And then specifically a little treat if you're Aquarius Rising, I was thinking about this for myself. And so here are some Saturn and Aries things that I wrote for Aquarius Risings. Stepping fully into my unique voice. That's something we can do with this patch of astrology. Timely honesty. It's a place of communication. Pausing before speaking. Being creative in my communication. Bounding, boundaried communication. A capacity for repeating myself and managing those boundaries. More discipline in my dream journaling. Disciplined mobility practices. And driving extra carefully. No texting and driving for 2.5 years, dear Aquarius Rising. So that is what I have for my riffing, for all of my squishing together of Aries and Saturn. I know that's a lot. There's just so many different inroads, but we know that Saturn is difficult stuff, heavy stuff, responsibility. We know that they're going to be asked to do those things quickly or suddenly, and maybe for the first time. So there's a lot of ways that Saturn is going to be uncomfortable, and there's going to be a lot of really neat ways that somehow complementary, they work well together. In a complementary way, they work well together. Look at those other videos that I made about the Neptune-Saturn conjunction and the Saturn-Saturn aspect in your birth chart, because that is going to add a lot of nuance to what this is. If you have any questions, you can always email me at aligninglight@gmail.com. So now with that, I think I'm ready to move on to the rising sign horoscopes. So I'm going to start with Aries, as is tradition. So sorry, Pisces, but now we have the technology of timestamps. So you can always run ahead to your sign or that of a loved one. And if you have anything you'd like to share below in the comments, please do so. Certain circumstances in your life that are fitting, maybe that you've already clocked with Saturn being in Aries the last 6 weeks. Let me know below if you're open to letting me know. Otherwise, I currently do not have any discounts running, but I always have a sliding scale. So if for any reason my services of astrology are not accessible, please take a look at that sliding scale. I have cheaper rates. And then also, regardless of what your financial stability is, even if you are very financially stable, if you qualify for my sliding scale, you could get a discounted reading as well. It's my way of giving back. So you can read all about that on my FAQ section on my website, www.aligninglightastrology.com. I'm Claire Moon. I'm a professional astrologer. I do this all the time for my whole job. I see anywhere from 8 to 10 people a week, and I make videos like this. So if you're interested, you can check all of that out at my website for booking. And if you're a student of astrology, again, I also have a bunch of resources for student astrologers on my website as well. And I do tutoring and mentorship. And I also do a once monthly question and response time, a little Q&A astrology time once a month. It's the second Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. Central Time on YouTube. And my forecast. I do a forecast once a month, also on YouTube. It's at the end of every month, so you can always check that out. I think I don't really have anything else going on that's too exciting for announcements. I think that's it. So yeah, I'll see you on the other side. I'm gonna probably be recording this in chunks, so you will no longer see my video on the corner, but I am here, and thank you for listening. Thank you for taking in all of this information about Saturn and Aries to understand how they are different and how they might be coming together over the next few years. Good luck. Good luck to everyone. I hope it goes very well. All right, Aries Rising. Aries Rising. I am actually going to take some things off here. Let's just keep Neptune up here because they're really part of this story. But focus this in on Saturn a little bit here. So for Aries rising, so for Aries rising, this is a special time because Saturn is in your first house of self, health, mind, body, spirit, the tangible parts, the immaterial soul bits, the whole thing. Saturn is now affecting that. And so for you, you're going to be noticing this with identities. Maybe at this point in your life, you've had a lot of experiences, a lot of maturity and wisdom has come in. And now maybe you're presenting as that more outwardly to others. Maybe others are seeing you or are going to in the next 2.5 years are going to see you step into that maturity or step into that experience, saying, yes, I do know things, I do have skills, coming into that, and other people noticing. Saturn in your first house can be that feeling of feeling old, slow, tired, a little lack of vitality potentially. Know that it's temporary. You're probably going to feel differently when Saturn leaves and gets into Taurus in April of 2028. But also to honor if you are feeling a little slower, to go at a slower pace, to honor Saturn that way. I do know when I had it in my first house, I started to get my first gray hairs. Now I need bifocals. Like I wear bifocals sometimes. So it was literally my body was aging and I was feeling it very acutely. But I'm also a day chart, so it wasn't that bad. And I don't remember a time in my life where I've been more disciplined. So perhaps Saturn in your first house will be a time when it'll be easier to be more disciplined with routines or habits or anything. Restraint, renunciation might be easier to say no to things that you've had a hard time saying no to. Saturn can be boundaries. So it might be a 2.5, 3 year period of time here where boundary maintenance and management is really important. Having them is really important. Saying no to things is really important. Uh, so there's going to be some constructive things here, but also some difficult things. There can be general delays. So, just in your general life, delays. Where is that letter? Why is traffic so slow? It could be any of those things. And Saturn also rules your 10th and your 11th houses. And so topics of career, life path are going to be very front and center for a few years, as well as topics of groups, friends, organizations, and your hopes and dreams and what you're moving toward in this life. So all of those 10th, 11th house topics are going to be very front and center, maybe happening at speeds or paces that are quicker than you expected. So hang in there if there are some difficulties or challenges, um, and know that it is a temporary transit. I guess last thing I would say is being careful around authority people. Um, Hopefully, your life doesn't have dangerous things around you, but if it does, being a little extra careful over the next 2.5, 3 years until April 2028 around authority people, because Saturn can be that kind of authority figure that's around, that's not you, that can be a little heavy handed. So be careful with that. And finally, and this I talk much more about in my Saturn Neptune conjunction, Neptune video, but the lack of clarity and certainty with Neptune is absolutely going to be around. And at the same time, this is very difficult for Saturn because Saturn wants realism, Saturn wants clarity, and it's having to work extra hard for that realism and clarity with Neptune around. So double check stuff, fact check yourself, just do that kind of extra due diligence, over communicate if you're feeling like you're being misunderstood. Um, I would say that would be a good course of action, especially throughout 2026, but probably the entire time Saturn is with Neptune and Aries. Very different things coming together. Now, it can be, your dreams and visions being made real and you doing that, and that could be very cool. And it can add a glamour factor, that Neptune. But when it comes to filling out forms, finding resources, in the real world, then Saturn's going to come in and they're going to want to do that. I think that's it. I think that's it for Saturn in the first house. I mean, there's so much more, but those are some of the key things I usually go to. So, discipline, responsibility, being very much in your purview. So, choose responsibilities carefully. Boundary management. Um, Speaking of boundaries, structure, order in the life, career, friends, those topics being louder for the next few years, general delays and slowness over the next few years, all of those things are possible. Oh, and last thing, besides feeling slow or old, if there's any doubt, self-doubt coming in with Saturn in the first, it's doubt with the self. That can go one of two ways. If you listen to my intro, you already heard me talk about this, but I'll restate it here. There's helpful doubt that can lead you on to investigation. That's that fact checking yourself, feeling, do I know that? Is that right? And it makes you even more mature and wise because you fact checked yourself before you said it. Or it can be that kind of doubt of self that is more based on fear, uncertainty, and it's kind of those doubt loops, analytical loops. Like, or feeling bad about the self, or feeling incompetent, or like you're not good enough, or not competent enough, and then not acting or just not doing anything. That is the other side, that other place that doubt can go into. So as Saturn is in your first house for the next few years, I would just try to keep aware, keep noticing when there is that sense of being really hard on the self or doubting the self versus the really constructive thing that Saturn could be doing, which is gently saying, hey, is that correct? Are you correct? That leads on to investigation. Nothing wrong with investigation. Okay, that's what I'll leave for Aries rising. Best of luck with everything. I hope you have a good 2.5 years with it. And if there's any questions, of course, you know where to find me. So let's speak with Taurus risings. Okay, Taurus rising. So what you've had over the last 2.5, 3 years since March of 2023 has been Saturn in your 11th house of friends, groups, organizations, larger networks of people. And so maybe having a lot of responsibility in those groups, taking on responsibilities. It could also be a thinning out of the friend group, a narrowing of the friend group. It could be over the last few years having to have healthy boundaries and manage those boundaries around friends or groups. And also all of these things, these Saturnian things, whether it's challenge or responsibility or loss around your hopes, dreams, and aspirations. So also having a lot of seriousness, taking your dreams seriously, moving toward your aspirations with discipline. All of that has been maybe some of the constructive stuff that's been going on over the last few years. And what I hope not is humblings in these areas as well. Humblings with working toward your aspirations, realizing the limitations or where needs improvement gets stamped on the report in terms of friends, groups, organizations, or what you're working toward. So now all of that Saturnian stuff is coming into your 12th house, which is a place, it's a few things. So my major buckets of stuff for the 12th house where we're now going to see Saturn's like challenges, delays, responsibility, hard work is going to be around the internal landscape. So mental, emotional, spiritual health, as well as hidden things. We'll get into it, I guess. I'm not sure what that's going to mean for you. Um, and the 12th house is a place of suffering. So, how we navigate suffering. And it is a place of enemies, which, I mean, okay, Saturn finds its joy in the 12th. The 12th house itself is of the nature of Saturn. So we're getting pretty Saturn-tastic up in here with Saturn coming into this place, being in their joy, being able to do loss very effectively, unfortunately, being able to do difficulty or hard work very effectively. But some of the things, there's nuance around some of these things. So with enemies, for instance, it can be real external people who are actual threats. That's a very real thing with enemies in the 12th. But the 12th can also be hidden enemies, especially hidden enemies in terms of false stories about the self. It could be a person who you don't know about, that type of, very real external threat who is also hidden and you don't know about them. Or it could be, again, these more internal, subtle ones like false stories about the self or self doubt or self loathing or all these things that kind of like pull us down that are kind of the call is coming from inside the house. And so that's what Saturn might be pointing at in terms of where is the hard work going over the next few years. It might be around those internal hidden enemies. It could be around boundary management to protect yourself from insulting influences. That could be a thing. Um, and then again, going back to those themes of internal landscape, you know, mental, emotional, spiritual health, and related practices. Saturn here could be you getting serious about that, or more serious than you already are. It could be um, having more discipline or structure around those things, like having, instead of me flouncing around doing I can be aware at any time doing anything. Uh, Instead of just that, having more of a formalized practice of some kind, doing a sitting practice every morning. That would be more doing a Saturn thing around a 12th house activity. So all of that is an option. But being really realistic, I know Neptune is here. I kept them on the board for a reason because I didn't want to forget that they were here because it will be part of Saturn's experience of, okay, yeah, structure and all of these, Saturnian discipline things. But Neptune's going to soften that. Neptune is also itself spirituality. So I'm very curious to see the Lord of Transcendence, Saturn, the last visible planet before we go off into this unknown sphere of the outers. There's something transcendent about Saturn, about what happens when you don't move for a really long time and your brain starts being different during meditation. There's, when you renounce things and that type of spiritual ascetic practice. I think that's all just kind of amped up by Neptune being alongside in terms of the spiritual potentiality of this. There's a lot of it. So, really dig into those spiritual practices, or if you're listening to this and you're more of a secular person and you're not like, I don't really have a spiritual practice, think of it as any formalized or structural practice you have that is there to manage your own suffering or your own internal whatever, your own mental health, emotional health, then put it that way. Either way, there's a lot of potential for some constructivity here. Now, what I hope it's not, now this is more the difficult side of things, the less favorable side of things. Be careful around large, wild, or exotic animals for whatever that's worth. This could be challenges there. Could also be having a lot of responsibility over those types of animals or non-human people. Um, and the 12th house is a place of feeling lonely at kind of least. It can feel like you're misunderstood. It can feel really isolating. At worst, it is a place, this 12th house, of straight up oppression, of marginalization, disenfranchised folks, all of that. So Saturn is in here really showing the real thing. There could be a lot of disillusionment, a lot of realism coming in around the level of suffering that might exist in the world. So if that's hitting you heavy, just make sure that you're taking care of yourself over the next few years. If you're having a lot of responsibility or accountability and you're working with underserved populations, I mean, this is bringing in career stuff for Taurus risings. Also, ninth house, worldview, belief, travel, advanced education, continuing education. I mean, this could very easily be someone getting an education We're having a career path that is now intersecting with 12th house groups of people or animals or spiritual practices. So it's bringing all of those life path things into the 12th. This could also be doing a lot of behind the scenes work for a few years, kind of making moves in silence, working on things that aren't so public or that aren't public right now. And it's also pretty travel-y. So there could be travel. But all to say, Saturn is doing Saturn stuff. Saturn's also bringing in some of these other house topics into the 12th. So there's a lot of constructive potential, but yeah, my main concern with some of those more difficult topics is if you yourself are experiencing oppression, if you yourself are experiencing marginalization, Saturn in Aries can be a really difficult authority figure. And at least if you're in America, like the response right now is, I think, some of the worst of this Aries Saturn when you put those archetypes together of being fast to reject or fast to criticize or judge or exclude. And then we're putting it in a place of exclusion. It's kind of saying the same thing twice and now very quickly. And so my concern is just authority figures being extra horrible. So just protecting yourself if you're a Taurus rising, this is a place of imprisonment. So be very careful, especially around travel for the next few years. I hate to give this kind of news, but I also would be remiss not to mention a possible challenge. So yeah, between now and April of 2028, Taurus risings, be very careful around some of these travel or authority threat people topics. If you have questions on that, email me, aligninglightaster@gmail.com, because I know that's kind of a sensitive set of topics. But yeah, that's one of the more difficult things I'm seeing here is just one of the, I guess, and part of my concern before, the last year happened. When I was looking at natal charts, I've noticed it in natal charts. I've noticed it in different areas of life for those people with Saturn and Aries natally, that oftentimes the response does not fit the circumstance, or the punishment does not fit the crime, or there's something out of balance. And what's out of balance here is Saturn, is the authority figure, is out of balance. What else? If you yourself, let's say things are going fine, you are doing great in your spiritual practices, and maybe you would like more responsibility or taking on more challenge, it might be time to level up in terms of spiritual stuff. If you have a good foundation, really leveling up on that. So good luck with it. I think that's it for Taurus risings. Yeah. Um oh, one last thing. Doubt. Now, the 12th house is a place of the mind, difficult mind stuff sometimes. It's a place of uh, bad spirit. And spirit was seen as kind of the intangible parts of the self or the will. So we literally here have ill will, ill spirit, kakos daimon. Like it sounds like shit demon. It's not great. Like it's a difficult. I come from the 12th. Hello. My sun and Mercury and asteroids and Neptune are all in there. And it's difficult mental stuff sometimes. Mental health, there's a reason why I put it in here. Um, Hidden health matters. What's my point? We know it's difficult. It's the 12th. What I'm worried about here, to be frank, is self doubt or being too hard on the self or having ill will toward the self. Um, so, in Pisces, it's really easy to have compassion. It's easy to open the heart and make the heart big enough to hold all of our irritations and impatiences and all these things. In Aries, things get pretty dry. Things are moving pretty quick. It's hard to have patience and have an open heart to ourselves or to others in some circumstances. So just make sure you're not being too hard on yourself. You're not being too hard on that internal landscape or being like, I haven't meditated 18 hours today. What's wrong with me? Don't get too hard on yourself, that internal authoritarian that could be a challenge here over the next few years. If you notice that internal dialogue becoming more negative or harsh or sharp, that could very well be a Saturn and Aries in the 12th kind of situation. So remember, what the quote that I was using with Saturn and Pisces comes from Cory Muscara, and he says, "Hold yourself with the highest standards, but also hold yourself with the greatest compassion." Saturn standards, compassion, and self-love, goodwill toward the self. That's Pisces kind of tendencies. Aries is more individuating. It's kind of carving out a space for itself. There's not as much time and space for that kind of softness. So don't forget the softness to the self over the next few years. I think that's my last thing. Good luck, Taurus Rising. Let's talk to Gemini Rising. You have Saturn moving into your 11th house of friends, groups, and organizations, your larger networks of people, as well as your hopes, dreams, and your aspirations. So, a lot of the things we talked about in the intro part, that is going to apply to your 11th house. Now, before and a little bit at the end of 2025, we're going to have Saturn in your 10th house. And so, what Saturn is finishing up with and what they'll be leaving is a place that has to do with your career, your life path, and your public life. And so, that challenge, delay, loss, a lot of responsibility, that kind of stuff is leaving the career, leaving the place of public life and life path, and also legacy. If we think about the 10th house being what we're leaving behind. And instead, Saturn is going to be bringing that responsibility, difficulty, delay, loss into the place of groups, friends, and what you're aspiring toward. Now, Saturn also does commitment, and they can get serious, and they can take on responsibilities in a group. So this can be, you know, a lot of beloved responsibilities or things you choose to do. But also on the other side of that spectrum, Saturn can be difficulties, delays, um, accusations, and loss. And so I want to name those things if that's been relevant for anyone, even in the last couple months. So Saturn's going to be in your 11th house. And the 11th house is also a place of your aspirations, your hopes, what you're working toward. And so Saturn can be getting really serious about those things, being responsible for your hopes and dreams, as it were. So that can be more of a constructive element that Saturn can bring into the 11th house. Um, but also, realism, boundaries, hard work, all of those things. Now, if you have one little nuance here, is this chart shows the midheaven over in the ninth. Let's pretend like the midheaven was in the 11th house. Maybe in your birth chart, you've got the MC in the whole sign 11th house. Then Saturn is going to continue doing that responsibility, challenge, delay, loss with career and life path stuff, even into its transit through your 11th house. So that experience that you've been having with Saturn in your 10th will be extended, for better or for worse. One other thing to note about Saturn going into your 11th house, if you're a Gemini rising, is that we can put all of these significations of Saturn aside for a moment. Just pretend like Saturn doesn't mean all the stuff that we've been talking about this whole time. And just note that Saturn also signifies 8th and ninth house topics. And so while Saturn is in the 11th house, they'll be bringing in ninth house topics, say, of travel into the place of friends. So you may be traveling more with friends in the next 2.5 years between now and April of 2028. Maybe you're not traveling, but your friends are, or they're feeling far away potentially. We also have advanced and continued education, becoming an expert in a topic, Maybe you're doing that in a group setting, making friends over shared education or shared views. It's a place of philosophy, sharing philosophy with friends, being part of groups around, I mean, this could be political, even if it was not religious or philosophical. This is also hopes and dreams, aspirations. So, aspiring seriously toward travel or toward a belief system, any of those aspirations around like advanced or continuing education, that could be going on over the next few years, as well as bringing eighth house topics into the 11th. So, if we think about aspirations, goals, things of that nature around eighth house, so your complex finances, getting serious around what you're hoping for, what you're working toward with complex finances, debt, taxes, your retirement portfolio, any of your provisions for death, as they used to call this place. The second house was the provisions for life, everything that supports the person while they're alive, money, food, clothes. The eighth house is things that support us in our end of life, things that support us in our third act of life, as well as beyond and after we leave. So you might be thinking a lot about what you might want to leave in terms of inheritance and how to manage that. Well, Saturn is in Aries. I imagine they're going to be pretty action oriented around these topics as well. They like, in fire, planets like to take action and do things. So that would be one constructive outlet for this. The eighth house can also represent collaboration and shared resources. So this could be bringing collaboration and sharing into the friend zone. So sharing with friends, working on group projects with friends or groups. I would just make sure, of course, with Saturn being involved with that and Neptune being around, that any of these topics, whether it's complex finances, end of life management or preparation, collaboration or sharing resources with others, make sure that expectations are clearly understood, if at all possible. I know sometimes it's hard to clock when we're having an expectation come up. They're natural to have. Our brains are little like anticipation machines. There's always making expectations because our brains are trying to assess for threats and survive and all that good stuff. So our brains are very good at doing this, but it's good to be aware of it. And especially when we're starting to work with other people, sharing of resources, it's generally more helpful to be clear about what everyone's expecting, what everyone's hoping for, and that way, you can head off disappointments and difficulties later down the road, dissatisfactions, if you will, being extra clear about, who's doing what, where, when, and why. All of that, because, as great as Neptune can be for softening some of what Saturn's doing, it's great for spirituality, creativity, things of that nature, and working with groups. When we're trying to actually put resources into action, Neptune can make things confusing, forms can be confused, actions can be confused, motivations can be confused. So the more that we're just doing our best to be as clear as possible. My Neptune antidote is doing Virgo and doing Saturn, essentially. Being discerning, slowing down, asking questions, getting into the details, not going too fast. So if anyone's rushing you, dear Gemini Rising, don't let people rush you. That's good advice for most things and places, but especially around these delicate financial or end of life issues, take your time. I really advise that, especially between now and March of 2026. I want Saturn to at least get on the other side of Neptune, which doesn't happen until after February of really effectively mid-February of 2026. Now, this can be on the worst kind of end of things, not to scare anyone, but this is real. I'm thinking about my own dad, who's a Gemini rising, and he's getting on in his years. So a lot of the things I just said are very relevant to him, and end of life, inheritance, all that kind of legal, logistical stuff that you got to do. But also, potentially in some ways, just socially, maybe a loss of a friend or a loss of a certain group with Saturn in the 11th. I that can be just because like interests change or someone moves. At worst, it could be because people die. So I don't want to predict death. Of course, it's very context dependent. Don't go looking for it if it's not around. But that is one very obvious delineation, I think, and I rarely use the word obvious. But I think if like any of my Hellenistic fans are watching this right now, any of the students of Hellenistic astrology, my fellow students, I'm a forever student, they're gonna see this and they're gonna be like, "Hey Claire, why are you not talking about the eighth house lord and the 11th? Like, come on." So I don't mean to be flippant, but at the same time, that's one of the more difficult potentials is loss of friends or groups, even loss of aspirations. You know, if the resourcing isn't there, we might have to set something down for a minute. And, you know, knowing that maybe once Saturn gets out of the 11th, a certain aspiration, if it's slow going toward a goal or slow going toward something that you've been working toward, maybe that lightens up after April of 2028 and Saturn gets out of here and stops slowing things down. So, you know, no, whatever's going on, it is at least the Saturnian impact after April 2028, there will be a change of some kind. Um, the ninth house, let's see, I didn't miss anything there, did I? Government, politics. Oh, publishing. Last thing, the ninth house is about publishing. So bringing publishing or mass communication into the space of aspirations. Maybe you're working toward releasing a book, or maybe you're starting a podcast. Maybe you are publishing or mass communicating something on behalf of a group or with friends, getting into a political movement. All of that in kind of a mass communicating way. That is also happening for Gemini risings over the next 2.5 years. So, putting those topics together and knowing that, you know, there's little short bursts of things. It feels more less like a whole encyclopedia and more like an essay. Very quick bursts of writing. That's what this looks like. Now that's going to be put that on top of whatever your own natal chart writing tendencies are. I would have to see your chart to look at what I might make of your creative or writing processes, but um, in general, during this ninth house lord and the 11th, but in Aries, these things could be happening quick or in short bursts. So if that's the vibe, cool, you're seeing it. I think that's it. Okay. So that's what I have for you, Gemini rising. I am excited in general for Saturn to get out of a square with your rising sign by whole sign house and to get into a sextile, which itself can feel a little bit lighter and less difficult in general. So I'm looking forward to that for you. So best of luck, Gemini rising. All right, Cancer rising. Saturn has been in your ninth house of long distance travel, continuing or advanced education, politics, publishing, institutions. Saturn is getting out of there. They have a little bit of unfinished business. But what they're going to be doing is spending more time over the next 2.5, 3 years in your 10th house of career, life path, public life, and legacy. And so Saturn is going to be bringing its challenges and hard work into the career. It's going to be bringing more responsibility into this sphere. So if you have a certain life path that you're carving out, if you are in a certain career trajectory, I expect one of a few things to happen. One of the possibilities is taking on more responsibility. Another possibility is loss. Another possibility is having to work hard, having delayed gratification, having to deal with authority figures, and having to deal with realism and limitation and constraint in the path, dealing with challenges in the path, barriers in the path. So all of that is coming into the 10th house of career life path. Saturn here is also going to be speaking to some realism about legacy, what's being left behind. It depends on what phase of life you're in. For younger folks, that might not be as much of a concern. But for those of you who are older, or those of you who maybe you're younger but you have children, this might be a time of getting really serious and thinking about things down the road and what happens after you're gone, what you would like to leave behind. It's kind of a big, heavy topic. Saturn is a big, heavy planet, so they're going to be bringing those topics to the fore. Saturn is also going to be bringing potential delays. So, in general, around you in the career, in the life path, or with public matters, there might be delays over the next couple years, 2, 3 years. You might be delayed in some way. The path might feel slow, grindy. It might be, I was talking earlier in the intro about challenges with pacing and patience. And I've already talked to a few people where they're going to be sticking out some really difficult circumstances for a couple years before they're able to get free from those. And so I can imagine Saturn being some difficult things that have to be endured for a while, but my hope is not forever. Now, we have to remember that Saturn is here with Neptune, and so for at least the next 8 or 9 months, it starts to slowly, gradually let up after March of 2026. But this uncertainty and lack of clarity that Neptune is imparting. Saturn would love to have a lot of realism and certainty and clarity on the path. They would love to have a structure and a plan, especially a long-term plan. Neptune makes that really hard. It makes things unclear, foggy, uncertain, messy. So if you can just get yourself through the next year, that would be great. Let's see what happens when Saturn's on the other side of Neptune. But know that, for the next few years, you might have your work cut out for you. So I guess now a practical word of advice might be to be judicious or careful about the responsibilities you take on in your life path. Hopefully, you have agency to choose which responsibilities come in. If you can choose, you know, uh, be careful about the responsibilities you choose because they will probably weigh on you. Now, Saturn can also be high liability work, people with high authority positions who are in charge of a lot of stuff. And so, if that's you having a high liability job where you're in charge of a lot of stuff, especially on behalf of others, yeah, that might be what's going on. So, take care of yourself over the next 2.5, 3 years, and good luck with everything. Now, if we move our attention to Leo rising. All right, for Leo risings, Saturn is going to be leaving your eighth house of shared resources, other people's money, taxes, debt, inheritance, complex finances, and end of life topics and death. Those are all eighth house things. For the last several years, there might have been a lot of responsibility, a lot of difficult things, challenges, delays, loss around these topics. Or having to get really serious around eighth house topics, having to get serious about complex finances, serious about planning end of life things. Estate management and planning is a whole thing. If you got married recently, maybe bringing together you and your partner's resources has been happening, and that level of commitment. So, all of that is soon going to be behind you as Saturn moves into the ninth house, where that challenge, delay, loss, difficulty, responsibility, commitment is going to come more into the ninth house sphere of college, continuing education, advanced education. So, hard work around those topics, delays around those topics, long distance travel, politics, institutions, publishing, mass communication. All of those ninth house things might be a little bit more difficult now. Now, there's going to be a little window here. Like, let's say you have a passport to apply for or something, dear Leo rising. There's going to be a window between September 1st of 2025 and February 13th of 2026 where Saturn's going to dip back into Pisces for a moment. And when they do that, that might be a good time then for you to get in an application for a passport and get any kind of long distance travel paperwork done. Or if you need to publish something or publish a website or mass communicate, it might be a decent time, There could be a bunch of other things going on that might make this not a good time, but at least from this narrow perspective, having Saturn out of your ninth house between September 1st and February 13th of 2026 might be a good little window to do your last minute ninth house things before Saturn gets back in there for good. So, Saturn is going to be getting serious about advanced learning or continued learning. The ninth house is also about divination, religions, philosophy, worldviews, beliefs, that whole bucket of stuff. Saturn might be getting skeptical, serious, taking a lot of time to investigate and doubt. And that might be a really fruitful process over the next few years. Now, if, like this chart, you have your midheaven in the whole sign ninth house, then Saturn is going to actually start to affect topics of the career, life path, and public life as well. Kind of the midheaven is going to bring in those 10th house topics. So then more responsibility with the career, more responsibility with the life path or the public life, more delays or challenges with those topics as well, if your midheaven is in the whole sign ninth in your birth chart. If you have publishing or mass communicating to do, maybe you're getting serious about something, maybe you're really broadcasting your expertise or mastery of a topic, but maybe also there are delays or challenges. Maybe you run into some barriers in putting out your website, things like that. So just keep going and know that this is a temporary thing that will wrap up in April of 2028. So good luck, Leo Rising. Leave early for the airport for the next 2.5 years. All your long distance travel, give yourself extra time to anticipate delays. That's my last thing. Good luck. All right, let's talk to Virgo Rising. Saturn is wrapping up their transit through your seventh house of partnerships, other people, clients, marriage partners, business partners, best friends, all those one-on-one people. That's where the challenge has been, especially since March of 2023. In this case, it might not have even been you having the challenge directly, but maybe your partners were having a lot of challenges or working through something or having to work really hard at something. Maybe you really had to commit to those partnerships over the last few years. There could have been a stress test to those partnerships over the last few years. All of that's wrapping up. And then what's going to happen after is Saturn's going to be moving into your eighth. Now they are currently in there and they'll be back February 13th for good until April of 2028. But when Saturn is in the eighth house, then they're bringing all of those aforementioned Saturn significations that I mentioned in the intro into your eighth house of shared resources, taxes, debt, complex finances, and end of life topics. And so if we'll use the example of getting serious about something, taking on some responsibility about something, it could be in figuring out your retirement plan, figuring out your complex financial situation, coming to a head dealing with debt or tax issues. Saturn could be getting serious about its investments. And Saturn could also be getting really serious about its end of life planning, estate management planning, or being given responsibility in dealing with that. So while we could grab onto that very obvious delineation of a planet of loss and death in a place of death is pretty deathy, right? And I think a lot of people who are Virgo risings might see this and be concerned. However, what I see this coming out as more often than not is all of the things that support death, the provisions for death, the getting ready for death, the planning of it, all the complex legal, financial things that go on with it. And I've been called crass in the past for talking about this stuff so plainly. So, if that's bothering you, I apologize for kind of my matter of fact way of describing it. But this is what Saturn does. They bring a little bit of realism into the place of end of life matters. And I think it is good to talk about, even if like you're looking at your own search circumstances or situation, and especially if everyone is doing great, that's the perfect time to talk about end of life management. When everyone's doing fine, when everyone's healthy, when no one's in a state of emotional duress, those are the perfect times to have these conversations. So it doesn't have to be knocking at your door for us to take some of these eighth house topics, to take the heat of them, to act on them. And when Saturn's in your eighth house, one way to carry that out, to act that out, would be to get really serious about eighth house topics like end of life management. Now, Neptune is going to make things a little tricky, especially at the end of 2025 and the first half of 2026, until Saturn gets on the other side of them and starts to pull away increasingly, gradually, slowly after March of 2026. These matters of the eighth house, complex finances, et cetera, sharing of resources, it might be a bit confused, a bit confusing, uncertain, unclear. And so, especially if you're dealing with the topic of shared resources, sharing, collaboration, whether you're sharing money, time, energy, talents, I would just be extra clear about expectations. Be really explicit about what is expected or not. Be really clear about boundaries. You may have to enforce them more than usual. It might be harder to enforce them. There might be things kind of pressing on boundaries, especially in 2025 and 2026. So Saturn is going to be dealing with that. And using the word no, and this is an important thing really since 2023 and will continue to be until 2028, is this journey of Saturn moving through your place of other and sharing of resources with the other, and what limits and boundaries to put on that and what structure to put on that. And a lot of times the word no is going to come into play, which can be hard for Virgo and Pisces because they like to be so darn helpful. And Saturn here might want to be taking responsibility for people, but also they can say no. And so that might be a thing to do with Saturn in your eighth house of sharing. Delegating responsibility. That's another thing that they could do in here. So good luck with Saturn in your eighth. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. And let's take a look at Libra Rising, who's going to have Saturn moving into one of their angles, into the seventh house of partners, others, one-on-one relationships, best friends, business partners, clients, other people. Now, Saturn is getting out of, finishing up their time in your sixth house of health, disease, recovery from disease. So the challenge of Saturn is leaving there, which I hope is good news for people. Now, Saturn can also be discipline and being really good at routines, which might have been helpful for Pisces over the last few years. I don't know. So that influence of structure is leaving, but hopefully you won't forget if that was helpful. But this is a place of pets, animals. Saturn can be loss. So if you lost any pets over the last few years, my condolences. It's not always going to happen that way. When Saturn comes back into the sixth, so for the remainder of this transit, usually my advice for people is if there's no problems, don't go looking for them. But at the same time, this isn't a time to just wait and see. If you think something's going on, I would definitely get it checked out between September 1st and February 13th when it comes to you or your pets or your animals. I wouldn't do the wait and see thing. I am not giving medical advice. But honestly, this is kind of good advice for everyone all the time. If I'm being, my usual old-timey pharmacist self and saying don't delay medical care. But when a malefic is in the sixth, I am definitely not delaying in medical care. That's going to be done. That's going to be wrapping up. Now, we do have the sixth house also being about labor. So challenges around labor, unemployment, delays or difficulties in the workspace, bosses that are not cool, any of those difficulties with labor, that is also going to be wrapping up at the end of 2025 and into 2026. And then where Saturn's going to go is into your seventh house of partners and other people. And now this is an interesting transit because it's one of the few where other people can actually start to signify what this is, and make it not directly about you. So it's not always going to be that, but Saturn in the seventh can oftentimes be that your partner is struggling, or your partner has a lot of responsibility, or your partner is having delays or challenges or difficulties. So, supporting them then becomes what you're doing with Saturn here. That's the responsibility, is helping your partner, taking care of your partner. Or, maybe they're less able to take on responsibility. It kind of depends on the context. I can see this as them not having as many resources to help out. I can also see Saturn as delegating responsibility to them if they could take on more responsibility, if you've been doing too much. So, Saturn in the seventh, it can be other people having the challenge, but it can also be your experience in relationship. So, of course, any challenges in the relationship going through stress tests, maybe you or your partner individually having problems that maybe those problems don't directly affect the relationship, like your relationship is strong, and yet, it's hard when both people are struggling, or one of them is, and that's usually some kind of stress on a relationship, even if it's, being handled and managed. So that could be the case. And then another more professional kind of related example might be that, and I see this one a lot. This is actually very different than the previous examples I've given. This is more about building in terms of people who have a private practice. So if you're like a lawyer, a physician, a therapist, an astrologer, a reader, a diviner, anyone who has like a one-on-one client practice, Saturn comes in and they are now committed to that practice, and they are building a client panel of people that come to them. And it's like this 2.5, 3 year long building process where they're taking on a lot of responsibility. They might be taking on the mantle of an expert or someone who has mastered something, or is experienced in a thing. They might be taking on that mantle in their one-on-one interactions, being an expert of some kind. So all of that would fit with Saturn moving through the seventh. Now, if you're a night chart, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious. This is going to be more of I think, a delay, a hindrance if you're trying to build a client practice of some kind. It is going to be the more difficult versions of this, so I don't want to like get your hopes up and say, yeah, go forth, it's going to be easy, or, it's a good 2.5 years to build a client practice. Well, Saturn itself does, I think, signify the building of a thing and the hard work that goes into a thing. It can also be delays and challenges. So just know that if you feel like you're running into the wind or swimming upstream, know that it won't last forever, but it's going to be pretty strong until 2028. If you have your descendant by degree earlier in Aries, you're going to feel that most strongly now. If you have your descendant later in Aries by degree, the most intense part of that difficulty is going to be more 2027, 2028. So, what else? There can be a decrease, a distancing, a cooling off of certain one-on-one relationships, partnerships, best friendships, business partnerships. There can be, and that can be a temporary cooling off or distancing. It can be a more permanent loss or distancing or permanent boundary put up with someone. So while I hope that no one loses important, significant others, sometimes Saturn can be loss. So I'm not going to pretend like that's not there. Again, don't look for any problems if you don't see them. But if you are a Libra rising, you've got important, committed relationships, just do your best to take care of yourself and the relationship. I think that's, if you're wondering what to do with, hearing that there could be a stress test, I think the most practical thing to do would be to do what you know is good, that would fortify and strengthen your relationship now, and not wait to do that. And including fun things like date night. So, another thing, let's put all of Saturn's significations on a shelf and forget for a minute that Saturn is about seriousness and commitment and delays and challenges. Saturn is also your fifth house lord, Saturn is your fourth house lord. So, Saturn is going to be bringing topics of the fourth and the fifth into your seventh. And so, in English, that means that topics of living situations are going to start to mix with topics of partners. So now there's more of a chance of committing to living with a partner or a partner moving in with you. There could be, parents being more of a front row thing in your life. Parents, that topic being louder for some reason, especially as it relates to your partnerships. The fifth house is fun, sex, pleasure, joy, creativity, self expression. And so also bringing fun and joy and play into your partnerships. That's another thing Saturn could be doing in your seventh house. So bringing date night into the partnership, bringing sex that is fun and joyous into the partnership. I know Saturn's kind of serious, but they are in a pretty fun, adventurous place. So that's a thing that we can also consider for all the Libra risings. I think that's mostly what I have for you. Oh, and last thing, Saturn is older people. So if for whatever reason you've got more elders coming in or older people that are around you more often, that could also be what Saturn is doing in here. So good luck with Saturn in your seventh. I would say, last thing, Saturn is other people saying no or you saying no to other people. So I think this kind of goes back to my point about boundaries, maintaining of them, restating of them, all of those things that we have to do with boundaries. Part of that is, sometimes saying no. And so, part of that Saturn transit in different areas of life is sometimes bringing the no word into those topics. So if that's coming up, know that that really fits the sky. Good luck, Libra Rising. All right, Scorpio Rising. You are having Saturn finish up their time in your fifth house of romance, creativity, children, fun, pleasure, all of those Venusian type things. That fifth house is going to get one more pass of Saturn at the end of 2025. So, the aforementioned in the intro, the challenges, delays of Saturn, also the getting serious and getting committed of Saturn. They're going to do one more round of that September 1st of 2025 through February 13th of 2026. And then Saturn is going to move more permanently here into your sixth house. And so the good news is that those challenges, delays, barriers, responsibilities having to do with romance, children, fun, self-expression, all of that should feel a lot lighter, less burdensome going forward, especially in 2026. So you got through a tough time there, especially since March of 2023. But with Saturn in your sixth, now those topics of challenge, delay, hard work, all of that's going to be more related to topics of labor, pets, and your health, including disease and recovery from disease. So when it comes to health topics, Saturn in the sixth can be getting really serious about health, getting more disciplined about health topics or routines, feeling a bit older. Saturn is literally what is old, slow. And so if you're feeling a little slower in the gym, like maybe you're becoming a gym elder, those are all possibilities. And also coming into an experience and a mastery with your own needs and what your body needs. At this point, Saturn is like, yep, I have a lot of experience about what I need. And now it just comes to applying it regularly, as much as Aries can do that. I don't necessarily want people to look for anything wrong. Whenever there's Saturn or Mars in the sixth house, there's a tendency to, I think, get worried about what could happen health-wise or with pets or with labor or any of these topics. But what I would say is if you have a problem, I wouldn't just do the wait and see route between now and April of 2028. I would go, if you have the resources and insurance, go get it checked out. Same with your animals and your pets. I'm not giving health advice. This is kind of good advice without astrology for everything. Really fits in with my own biases. But, if something comes up, don't do the wait and see. Just go get it checked out. Even if it comes to nothing, that's okay. You get peace of mind. So, with Saturn being more careful, methodical, and when it comes to pets, if you got an older pet, this could be just really noticing that age, noticing that change in your relationship as that pet ages. You could be committing to taking care of animals with Saturn in your sixth house. It could end up being a lot of chores or work that, maybe you lovingly decide to do. It can also be loss. And so I don't want to scare anyone, but loss is a real thing that Saturn does. And so again, I'm not expecting anything bad to happen, but if you have the resources to take care of things promptly, I would recommend doing that over the next few years. When it comes to any of these topics, labor, pets, health, Neptune can be uncertainty, lack of clarity. And so that's really strong for the next 8 or 9 months. Slowly, gradually, after March of 2026, that kind of uncertainty, lack of clarity will at least get off of Saturn. Saturn will get past Neptune, start moving on, and then other areas of life should clear up a little bit more. But yeah, double check things. Make sure the pharmacy didn't mess up your meds. I get to say that. I was a pharmacist forever. Uh, those double checking of things, because now Neptune is in your sixth. If you're at the gym, make sure you double check the weights before you try to lift them. Neptune can also be really spiritual. It can really help with creativity. And so also you can use that for your advantages at work, more creative. If being spiritual and how you take care of your health is helpful, that would really jive with what's going on in this sky. So it's not just these notes of seriousness, discipline. We also have this softer note of acceptance, flexibility, adaptability in whatever structures are coming about. Um, when it comes to labor, this could be taking on more responsibility at work. That would be one more constructive thing that's going on, and hopefully you have agency over what responsibilities are being handed to you at work. It could be a difficult authority figure at work, or people just being rather impatient at work. So if you're noticing, on your day-to-day grind, your day-to-day job, if people are being a little less forgiving over the next 2.5 years, that would be a Saturn and Aries in the sixth type of thing. If you yourself are being really hard on yourself about health, pets, labor, that's also Saturn. So it's like if other people aren't hard on you, it could be that you're hard on you. When it comes to responsibilities at work, Saturn is often in charge of things, management. So there's something here about management, either being it or having to deal with it. That's also very relevant. So I know I gave a lot of possibilities for what Saturn could be doing in your sixth. There's a plethora more of ways that I could put together the themes and significations that we discussed in the intro in terms of these bigger topics. One thing I did forget though, and I should mention, so I was really focusing on the three buckets of things with health, labor, pets. The sixth house is also a place of advocacy. In general, it's a place of exploitative labor, and we're either, doing a wage paying job more neutrally where we're just not getting paid enough. At best, it is service work, and we are choosing lovingly not to get paid or compensated. And at worst, it is slavery or exploitative labor. So, within that whole spectrum of things, we get service work, advocacy work. We also get this is the joy of Mars. So, we get conflict, war, conscription. We get protesting, fighting, protesting around labor, basic health conditions, all kinds of things you can protest. And so with Saturn coming in there, I mean, maybe taking on responsibility, organizing for some of these things, taking on responsibility in a service-oriented way. So just being sure that you're taking care of yourself, that you're not taking on too much responsibility too quickly here. But that could be another, more constructive thing that Saturn is doing. Saturn could also be if you are like a protester, advocacy worker, helper person out there trying to make things better. If you're running into more delays, if you're running into just people being harsher in general as you try to do what you're trying to do, like the labor unions or something, if you work for one of them and you're running into more Saturnian barriers, I wouldn't be totally surprised, but know that it's temporary. And if you hang in there till April of 2028, that'll move on. So good luck, Scorpio rising. I hope everything goes well for you. And you know where to find me if you have any questions. I know the sixth house can be a bit sensitive in terms of the topics that are in there. So if anything was concerning in a way that's going to keep you up at night, please email me at aligninglightastrology@gmail.com. Otherwise, I think there's a lot of constructive stuff that could happen in here as well, as you heard. Best of luck, Scorpio. Let's see how this is going to go for Sag. Sagittarius, you are getting Saturn wrapping up their business, finishing up their time in your fourth house of home, living situation, parents, past, ancestry, your private life. All those fourth house things have been getting a challenge. Parents, home, private life, getting a stress test, getting delays, maybe picking up responsibilities having to do with that. If you've been noticing parents getting older, if you've had any loss, all of that would be very reflective of a Saturn through the fourth transit. That is coming to a close, and Saturn is moving into the fifth house. And so some challenges, delays, responsibilities coming into the fifth house of romance, creativity, children, fun, and delights. It's the joy of Venus. That's where a lot of those words come from. Now, sometimes when people have babies, Saturn is in the fifth because they're now getting a lot of responsibility having to do with children. So that's a possibility. That's something I see. On the more constructive end of the spectrum, we can also see commitment romantically, committing to romantic partners, being more serious about dating, being more serious or responsible around your sexual health. All of those things could be Saturn in the fifth. But Saturn can also be delays, challenges, difficulties around children, trying to have children, delays or difficulties around dating or trying to have romance. All of those things, we can see some possibilities that are more constructive and some that are a bummer. Now, if you have children who are grown, I mean, and when I say grown, oh my goodness, that can mean so many things. A 7-year-old becomes so serious all of a sudden. So they don't have to be out of your house. But sometimes Saturn in the fifth can be that your children get a bit more serious or they are given a responsibility. Maybe they're taking on like a pet for the first time or something like that. So it can be more of those benign, like, oh, little Timmy is growing up, those moments. Or it could be, yeah, the children are leaving the home. You now have an empty nest. What are you going to do with it? That can be Saturn in the fifth. Now, when it comes to fun, pleasure, rest, those more joyous, leisurely things that Venus imparts, sometimes Saturn comes into your fifth and you realize, wow, I've been working very hard. I'm very tired. I must get serious now about my rest. I must get serious now about scheduling in time to have fun. So get serious about fun if you need to. Carve out time, schedule it in, structure in fun if you need to. And if you're a creative person, now Saturn is getting really serious about your creative life, your creative expression. If you're already a serious artist, maybe you're taking on even more responsibility, bigger, uh, what do they call them? Uh, Commissions. Maybe you're taking on bigger commissions, or the projects are requiring more of your mastery and effort. There's a lot of potential for building, mastering, really becoming an expert in whatever creative craft you're doing or creative expression that you're doing. And also maybe bringing a more mature voice to that. Saturn can be loss, delay. So make sure you back up all your stuff on a hard drive, save it somewhere. Don't put the hard drive in a weird place you're going to forget. When it comes to like resistance to the creative process, that's a whole discussion. But if you're running into, I don't really like the word block, like writer's block, creative block. I think what it does is it just reifies and affirms that there's a block, that there's something in our way. And instead, what I recommend is if there is resistance to creation, resistance to expressing the self, examining that resistance. What is underneath there? What's in there? Is it fear? What is it a fear about? Is it lack of patience, lack of being able to focus or sit still for long enough to do the thing? Where is the resistance or discomfort when there is a sitting down to be creative? Is there an ability to feel safe to be able to be creative? So, Saturn resistance can be about so many things. Creative blocks can be about that, resistance can be about so many things. And they really do require examination. So, if worst case, creatively, Saturn is throwing in some difficulties or some exhaustion, or at worst, a block, know that there are ways around that, and that it's temporary. And eventually, Saturn's going to be out of here. So, let's see. Pacing. I talked a lot about pacing in the intro video. This may be expressing oneself with a mature voice for the first time. It might be your more experienced voice for the first time. It could also be self expression when one is maybe not ready. Saturn might want to wait or hold back, but Aries is not going to allow that. It kind of begs to be expressed. Saturn can be a bit of a lid on the self expression, so make sure that you are not repressing the self, censoring the self in a way that is deleterious to your soul. Overall, Saturn is in a trine with your rising sign, so it's less of a threat to your life force in general, even for night babies. One last thing to consider is that we can put aside all of Saturn's significations for a moment and also consider that Saturn is going to represent the second and the third house. And so Saturn is also going to be bringing in these topics of resourcing, money, time, energy, anything that's supportive into the place of creativity. So this could be about investing into creativity, investing into children, spending on these topics, into your romantic life as well, or into your own fun, creativity, anything that's enjoyable. Just putting money into that. That could be what's going on with this configuration, as well as with the third house. Now, this is maybe all of those things I was mentioning about responsibility with creative works, taking on larger, more effortful commissions. Now, maybe that's related to your communities or nearby local spaces. Maybe you're taking on more responsibility roles in a creative manner that have to do with your local space, like being a local dance teacher or something like that. Um, the fifth house with children. Now, this is a little bit of a different set of delineations, but thinking about Saturn, finishing up their time in Pisces and your whole sign fourth, being in the fifth house, and then, we still have to talk about the IC being in the fifth. But Saturn could be representing challenges that aren't directly yours, but that are that of your parents or grandparents or ancestors, or challenges that have to do with your children or your children's challenges or things along those lines, where you're supporting parents or supporting children who are going through some kind of challenge or delay or loss. So it's not in this case it might be similar to what goes on when a planet is in the seventh, where it's about the other people. This could be about those fourth or fifth house people. So that's one possibility. And then the final possibility I want to discuss is if your IC, so here it's shown at the very end of the fourth whole sign house. In many charts, the IC is in the fifth whole sign house. And that is going to just extend Saturn's influence on topics of parents, home, dwelling, private life, um, past, ancestry. So, you've been experiencing since March of 2023 challenges potentially with living situations, parents in your private life. If your IC is in the fifth, those types of challenges might actually continue even after Saturn leaves Pisces. But just know that, if you've got a IC very early in Aries, like in the first few degrees, the most intense part of the Saturn type significations, the most intense of these themes is going to be more in 2025, 2026 versus, the later in Aries the IC gets by degree, the more this is extended and might continue. So, um, if there's questions around that, I know that gets into some technical details. You can let me know in the comments below, or you can email me, aligninglightaster@gmail.com. But I wanted to name that nuance because I don't want, let's say someone with with IC in early part of Aries and the whole sign fifth like this. Let's say that they were expecting their parent challenges to be done when Saturn left Pisces, and their parent challenges continue. And they're like, what gives? Saturn's not even in my fourth anymore. Well, if Saturn's not even in your fourth anymore, they might still be on your IC if it's in early Aries. And so that I don't want to like accidentally gaslight those people. Um, and then I guess it's worth mentioning too that anytime Saturn is on the IC or anytime anything is on the IC, it's opposing the midheaven. So the IC is the subterranean point, the lower heavens, the bottom of the sky. The midheaven, the MC, is the top of the sky ish. And uh, Saturn is going to be opposing this point that has to do with career and life path. So, all to say, if you can just get your buns to 2026 and then even more 2027, and then especially get your buns to April of 2028, then this type of Saturnian struggle, challenge, whatever it's been, will wrap up. So this is not forever, but it is a slow one. Best of luck with that. And let's see how our first Saturn ruled person is going to be doing with this. We've got Capricorn Risings, who themselves are Saturn. And Saturn is going to be getting out of your third house of short distance travel. They're going to be leaving that place. So I hope that your traffic improves with Saturn and Aries. Communication may be improved with Saturn leaving Aries, or sorry, leaving Pisces. With Saturn leaving Pisces, hopefully sibling interactions are better. In-laws, cousins, aunts, uncles, familiar people, people in your local communities. All of that's been getting challenged and stress tested for the last few years, and that's coming to a close. If you've taken on a lot of responsibilities in your communities, in your local spaces, or if you've taken on a lot of responsibilities with familiar people, that that era of responsibility either itself is going to come to a close when Saturn leaves the third, or you'll get it into such a holding pattern, into such a stable place that it is not going to be the front of your difficult list. It's not going to be the weightiest of responsibilities anymore. So we like to see that. Third house is also divination, dream divination. Saturn is leaving that place, so those things might be a little lighter, easier. And also, maybe Saturn over the last few years has been getting really serious about education, getting very serious about divination or communication, and that era is coming to a close. Another way to consider this, or like these ends of eras, might be just putting aside all of the Saturn significations for a moment, except that you are Saturn and Saturn represents the first house of self. And really, I mean, this path of Saturn for all of the Capricorn and Aquarius risings, it really shows this long-term focus for these 2.5 to 3 year periods of time that Saturn or you are really focusing on certain areas of life. So, for instance, Saturn just got out of my second house. And you know what? I have been focusing on my resourcing and my needs a lot over the last 2.5 years. I'm guessing that with Saturn in your third since March of 2023, I'm guessing just in general, the third house has been a big focus. Whether or not it's communities, local spaces, learning new things, short distance travel, uh, you know, on and on and on. I guess dream divination and divination in general, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, in-laws, all of these long lists of third house things might have been a focus, for better or for worse in all the different ways. And now that focus is going to go more into the fourth house, and in whatever way it is, I can be pretty certain, if anything, in this whole entire video, that your focus is going to be very fourth house related until April of 2028. So, at the very most neutral, I think this is the case. So you can reflect back. You can look back at my Saturn and Pisces video and see what things correlate and get a feel. I think that's a good exercise to do because then we can spot, well, what Saturn, what are they and what might they be bringing to this new place, the fourth? And so now if you do have responsibilities, they're going to be more at home in your private life with your family, with parents. There might be more responsibility being taken on regarding topics of ancestry. Maybe you task yourself with figuring out some ancestral stuff and do the hard work that takes. Um, it's topics of the past in the fourth, our own conditioning, our own past, the past of our family. So Saturn can be taking on some kind of responsibility there or hard work there. Saturn is also challenges, stress tests. So if there's any challenging things coming up with parents, family, private life, that's a possibility. Um, the fourth house is living situations, buildings, houses, real estate. If you are doing any home projects between now and April of 2028, this would make sense in terms of the hard work that takes, but there also might be some delays or challenges in that process, especially if you're doing anything over the next 8 or 9 months between now and March of 2026, doing your extra due diligence, doing extra research about any contractors that you let work in your home, um, doing any extra research that you need to do, extra inspections if you're trying to buy a home. All of that stuff would be really prudent because Neptune is around and they're making things a little less clear, less certain, most intensely in 2025, 2026, and maybe even still a little bit in 2027 into 2028. Um, Saturn can be loss. I don't want to make anyone nervous, but Saturn is a planet of loss. distancing, cooling off. So sometimes there's just a temporary cooling off of relationships or a temporary distancing of relationships having to do with family or parents. But it can be loss that is larger than that. Depends on your context or your circumstances. And when it comes to the fourth, one thing I haven't mentioned is also land, earth, the literal dirt beneath our feet, agriculture. Saturn themselves is a lord of dirt and agriculture. So honestly, like 2025 through 2028, I'm going to say it's a great time for gardening, for doing any kind of like short-term, short, easy projects. I would definitely pick more of the short-term, short bursts of project type of thing, not like a long-term project. But yeah, all of that's jiving. And then last thing, Saturn is secrets. So when it comes to the private life, it's already a place where there's some secrets because it's private, not in any kind of sneaky way, but in a just a privacy needs way. And that might be extra notable during this time, topics around what is said, what is not said, what is known or unknown. There might be some of those themes around what is being honestly or truthfully told, or how are we doing timely honesty with family, with parents, things like that. Because Aries is very honestly expressive. It's very raw, authentic honesty, usually, to the point of being almost careless about how it expresses itself. Saturn is going to be a little bit more careful and to the point of keeping secrets. So, Neptune's kind of the wild card in there, dissolving a bit of the secrets sometimes. But that's a very incongruent thing that Saturn and Aries are having to deal with. And so I can imagine like one benign way that this could come out, this idea of deception or secrets or ignorance in the fourth house. This would be the classic, like lying to your child and saying, we are out of ice cream. I am so sorry to tell you, the ice cream truck has left. You cannot have a 16th bowl of ice cream today. And yeah, maybe it's a little white lie, maybe it's a little fib, but it's necessary. I can easily see it being something like that, or how to tell little Timmy that Santa Claus isn't real or whatever, we can deal with all these things, or, people finding out that, XYZ this isn't how this works. This is actually how the sausage is made. And there's a lot of that happens, especially with kids. So, where they figure out all these things about the world, all this disillusionment about, the whimsy of the world. That's one way that this can come out that's not, super remarkable. But I think I've said enough, probably too much. Good luck. Or actually, no, I haven't said enough. Last thing, you are Saturn. And so you're going to be probably, you and Aquarius risings are going to be feeling the most palpably this incongruence between pacing, how fast things are going, how much thought or consideration is put in before things are happening. If there's any kind of incongruency or difficulty around that kind of stuff, yeah, that makes sense. And you might have to be extra patient for like 2.5 years. If there is a difficulty in having open-heartedness and compassion for yourself, especially if you're a parent or you're helping parents, Saturn and Aries can be frustration. And I hope Neptune around will soften things and give some compassion for the self. But remembering to, as Cory Muscara says, hold yourself with the highest standards, but also hold yourself with the greatest compassion. I worry that Saturn in Aries can be really hard on things, like very critical, quickly judgmental. And so if you're being hard on yourself about your parenting or your family life or something like that, just make sure you're not being too hard on yourself. Okay. I think that's it. I think that's it for Capricorn Rising. Good luck. Hang in there. Uh, pack snacks before you make tracks. All right, Aquarius Rising. You have to leave early for everything for the next 2.5 years. Saturn is in your place of short distance travel, local travel. So leave early. There might be more traffic. There might be a delay, some kind of detour. That'd be Saturn in the third. No texting and driving. That's good advice for everyone, everywhere, all the time. But especially for Aquarius risings between now and April of 2028, be very clear about your driving and your communicating and your traveling. When it comes to your email, your inbox, I would highly recommend setting that if you, I don't know how other types of email work, but a lot of them now you can have an unsend function, like an undo email, unsend email, and it'll let you put it for like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. Max that shit out. Max it out. The most time that you can unsend an email possible. That will behoove you, dear Aquarius rising. This gives a glamour factor. I mentioned it a little bit when I was talking about Neptune and Saturn's conjunction, that video, but I'll say it again here, especially for Saturn ruled people. Neptune can add a bit of glamour. It's really helpful for creativity. It helps us make connections between stuff. It makes us more intuitive. And so, using that intuition, strengthening that muscle, and even using it to communicate. Neptune is going to be around. This isn't going to be a just plain Saturn and Aries transit. And so some things that Saturn is doing here are going to be softened. They're going to be augmented a little bit, made a little bit more spiritual, artistic, creative, or forgiving. Thank fluff. Because what would we do? This can be pretty unforgiving. If you're being hard on yourself about communication, hard on yourself about your driving, about your sibling communications, whatever it is, just know that you might be being too hard on yourself. Saturn in Aries is pretty quick to judge. I'm hoping that Neptune is going to soften some of that and make us a bit more forgiving. But it might, especially that kind of being your worst critic. It's going to come up the most, I think, with third house things. And this also comes with learning, especially learning or teaching foundational things. So now Saturn is going to be dealing with maybe more responsibility, potentially, at best. Hopefully, some responsibility that they have chosen. And at worst, this is going to be difficulties in learning or difficulties with learning or teaching a foundational thing. So we can have a lot of responsibility and hard work around learning, but also some challenges around learning. And then the thing to know is that the worst part of this is probably when Saturn's with Neptune. So between now and March of 2026. And it's only at the very latest going to go until April of 2028. So if you can just get through to that period of time, I can absolutely imagine someone doing a 2 to 3 year course of some kind and having to grind and study and work really hard and kind of show up again and again and again for something. And that's okay. So Saturn might be doing something like that. The third house is siblings, cousins, in-laws, aunts, uncles, chosen family, chosen siblings, anyone who's familiar or nearby. Now, Saturn here might be that you're showing up in those relationships as an older person or as more experienced or mature. It could be that those people are showing up as the older person. That's one possibility. It could be a more serious or committed kind of development in any of these relationships. Like if you start working on a project with a sibling or a cousin that you need to commit to and show up to regularly, that would really fit this guy. But there can be, challenges, delays. So make sure I would say anything to do with these third house people, neighbors, cousins, aunts, uncles, in-laws. I would be really explicit and clear about expectations. There can be a lot of confusion and misinterpretation, a lot of misunderstanding with this configuration. So, even if it's a little bit annoying to some people, over communicating or restating needs, restating facts, not assuming that people know or understand. That is usually a good policy when Neptune is around. And there can be expectations with both Saturn and Neptune. Saturn has its standards, which is fine. Standards are okay. But then Neptune has fantasies and ideas about how things are going to go down. And so when you put that together, you can get a real recipe for some expectations. So just making sure that all of that is really out in the open and up front, that can be really helpful over the next 2.5, 3 years, especially with those third house people, but maybe in general. Third house is a place of rituals, of the embodiment of our beliefs. You know, if we've got the ninth house, that's the big rule book. The third house is doing that book. The Christian version would be going to church, would be a third house thing. If you're an astrological magician, the third house would be that I like pick a flower at the right planetary hour of the right planetary day. So it's that embodiment of belief in the third house. And Saturn might be getting serious about that. They might be getting more disciplined in how they do ritual, especially with Neptune around. That could add that more spiritual, creative tone to things. But over the next several years, if you find yourself wanting to be a bit more serious about your ritual life, about embodying, practicing what you believe, Saturn can be a lot of help for that. And especially if you're Saturn and now you're going to be in this very action-oriented fire sign, it makes sense too to want to embody something or act on something. So it could have to do more here with these third house topics, feeling maybe even more activated to do a path of learning, to communicate in a certain way. And then finally, taking on more responsibility in the community. That's one possibility here. If there's any community group that you're a part of, taking on more of a role in those groups. That could be what Saturn is doing here. I would definitely try your best to, depending on your context, avoid speeding. It depends on what country you're in. The country that I'm in is the United States, and I don't trust any authority person further than I can throw them. So here I would not, if you're an Aquarius rising, this is that authority figure, that problematic authority figure that could be Saturn and Aries. And if you have this in your birth chart, I'm not saying that you are a problematic authority figure. It can be experienced in people's response. I was mentioning earlier in the intro that Saturn and Aries, a lot of times the consequences don't fit the action. And so I don't want anyone getting in any unnecessary trouble that unfortunately is due to someone out there on a power trip or abusing their authority. But if we are going to see things like that, I would expect it in the third house. And so I have seen, unfortunately, this be, people who have relatives or friends or neighbors who are at risk of these authority, these challenging authority figures. They're going to be around here for another 2.5 years. I know that that's not happy news, but also we know it's not going to last forever. And we know to validate and not to dismiss some concerns or being extra safe or careful. And I would say too, over the next 8 months between now and March of 2028, Neptune really is that kind of disguise and hiding of face and deception. And that kind of deceptive note is extra loud in 2025 and 2026. So be safe out there. Do your best. Don't go too fast. I've been likening this to running through a mirror maze where the first thing you want to do is not run. So if you're in a maze full of mirrors, the best approach usually is to move very slowly and carefully to make sure that you know what you're looking at before you say anything, do anything, whatever. Yeah, and that's good advice for everyone, as long as Saturn is with Neptune, is to kind of double check yourself on things and go slow. And one last thing to consider would be that if you are Saturn, if Saturn is the signifier for self, body, spirit, wherever Saturn goes as it makes its trip through the zodiac, they're really just they're taking an extended period of time to focus on those topics of life. So when Saturn is in the first house and you're a Capricorn or Aquarius rising, so this goes for both of them, there's more of a focus on the self. There's more of that spending time with the topics of the first. I can speak from experience. I'm getting done with Saturn in my second house as an Aquarius rising. And my focus very much over the last 2.5 years has been my money, my time, my energy, my resourcing, the skills that I have that help me for resourcing or to resource others. So that has absolutely been the focus, for better or for worse. And so then I expect for Aquarius risings, when Saturn is in the third house, that there's just going to be some focus on the third house. So there's a long list of topics here, all of the third house people, all of those local or familiar third house spaces, the roles that you have with those people or in those spaces. This is a place of divination, communication, writing, ritual. What am I missing? I'm sure I'm missing something, mobility. So all of these things might be a focus over the next 2.5 years until April of 2028, for better or for worse. So just very neutrally, we can just put aside all of Saturn's significations and just remember that wherever Saturn is for you as an Aquarius rising, you're just going to have an extended focus in these topics for a while. The other thing I wanted to note here, special considerations. Let's pretend like the bottom of the sky, the IC, is in the whole sign third house in your birth chart. And so whatever the IC is, wherever that is, it's bringing in those fourth house topics. Symbolically, the IC is the same as the fourth house bucket of symbolism. So parents, um, living situations, past, ancestry, parents, grandparents, family, private life, all of those things, the land. That's all fourth house, but that's also the IC. And so when Saturn enters into Aries, if this is your situation natally, then you're actually going to get a bit of Saturn's responsibility, discipline, hard work, delay, commitments, loss around fourth house topics, maybe a little bit sooner than when Saturn gets into the fourth. So I just want to point that out if people are, looking at whole sign astrology and, especially if you've got, like, let's say you've got your IC by degree really late in Aries in your birth chart. Say if you've got your IC, whoop, let's say you've got your IC at late Aries, then once Saturn gets over here, you might start noticing in 2027, especially 2028, that you're having more responsibility having to do with land, living situation, committing to land or living situations, more hard work, commitment related to parents, or just having those topics of fourth house. Again, like I was mentioning more neutrally before, just having those topics of parents, living situation, private life much more prominent and not having to wait until Saturn is in Taurus to start experiencing that. So you might get a bit of that Saturn and Taurus type of stuff in one way of saying it before April of 2028. If that was a bit too technical, I know that was kind of technical. I'm not sure how well I explained that. You can always email me if I just confuse things. aligninglighastro@gmail.com. But I think that was my last thing with Saturn in the third house for Aquarius rising. Best of luck. And finally, we have Pisces rising. Congratulations, Saturn is getting out of your first house. of self, of identities, mind, body, spirit, in general being a challenge, in general being a stress test. Saturn can be, well, they can be discipline and structure. That can be really great. Healthy boundaries, creating nice and healthy boundaries for the Pisces rising. That's always nice. But, they can be tough. They can be challenges and delays and barriers and obstacles, and all of that has been in your general purview since March of 2023. That chapter is coming to a close, and Saturn is moving into your second house. And so the second house is about money, resourcing, any of your provisions for life, anything that supports you. And that can become very abstract. But one of the most simple ways to talk about the second is often money. It's also your time and your energy and your talents. Those are also resources that you have. And Saturn is going to be coming in here for a few years and making things a bit more serious. Maybe you're getting more serious about money. Maybe there's commitments that are coming in around money, more structure imposed by you or externally around money or resourcing or time, any of those things. But it can, just to be frank, it can be a difficult time around money. It can be having not as much, losing money, a decrease in money. So I don't want to make anyone nervous, but this is a good time. If there is any money coming in, I would do my best to save it. I personally am an Aquarius rising. I'm just getting done with Saturn in my second house, and I can confirm that it did a lot of these things. Now, Saturn is also the ruler of your 11th house. And so Saturn in the second could be that for some reason, friends, groups, networks of people have something to do with your resourcing and money. So don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to keep your ears open for opportunities for money from friends or resources, any kind of opportunity to support yourself that you might get through a group. All of that would also be relevant. Um, there can be delays. So if you're noticing things with money just moving more slowly than normal, yep, that could be. So giving extra time if you need to with certain financial transactions, double checking, especially in 2025 and 2026, double checking any transactions that happen that you're unclear about. If you need to check a bank statement on something or double check that the Venmo transaction happened. It's not a bad idea to double check on those things. But I guess getting away from the idea of money for a second, if we think about Saturn having more boundaries around things like your time and energy, and then knowing that Aries is a really self-advocating sign, it advocates for itself, it asserts for itself. I can easily see this being, some help in asserting boundaries around your time, around your energy, saying, hey, I'm not willing to work for free. I will not, take this poor compensation. So I'm hoping that Saturn can be some of that helpful energy for some people. And then finally, the second house is also your needs. So I think talking about it in this way of needs, and needs are material, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, sexual. People have all kinds of needs. And Saturn here can have us getting serious about that, asserting for our needs, saying, yeah, this is actually what I need. And I am going to say that, this is part of the structure of my life that I get this need met. So Saturn can have us be a bit more serious about getting our needs met and standing up for that and having certain standards around that. So that can be a really helpful thing that they do in here. And when it comes to boundaries around that kind of stuff too, when it comes to being in a relationship with others, maybe part of what is needed are boundaries around certain things. So there's a lot of psychological, kind of more internal, less tangible things that Saturn is going to be doing in here as well. In general, if I see them also sending an oppositional ray to the eighth, And making sure that whatever is being collaborated on in this life, whatever is sharing or being shared with others, it is fair, sustainable. Yeah, that it's fair and sustainable. So best of luck, Pisces rising. Really, congratulations. Happy day on you finishing up a Saturn in the first house transit. That itself can be pretty tough. And just even getting it off of the angles can sometimes help Saturn just not be quite as loud or in our face. So best of luck. And I think that's it. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you to everyone who hung out for the intro as well. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. I'm at www.aligninglightastrology.com. You can email me at aligninglightastro@gmail.com. My name is Claire Moon, and hit the like button for me. You can also subscribe if you would like to keep up with this. And I also have a newsletter on my website that you can sign up for. I send out one a month. I'm going to be sending out an email about when the sun ingresses into the next sign. That's about when I send it out. I think that's all my announcements. Thank you again, everyone, and best of luck with Saturn and Aries.